As American forces advance through the Iraqi desert, there are reports of fierce fighting in the north and the south. Tonight, reports of the first casualties of war. 16 American and British soldiers killed in a helicopter crash.
This is an NBC News special report. Target Iraq. Here is John Siegenthaler.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight, the terrible risks of war have hit home. The first coalition casualties, 16 American and British soldiers were killed when a Marine Sea Night helicopter crashed in Kuwait. It is the second day of America's second war in the Gulf, 7:35 Friday morning in Baghdad. Other developments now, huge explosions have been reported in the southern town of Basra and the northern town of Mosul. Bombs fell earlier today on Baghdad, doing intense damage. And here at home, the biggest anti-war protest the nation has seen. Thousands of people gathered in Chicago, shut down the city's famous Lakeshore Drive, staging a march in the middle of rush hour. However, at this hour, all of that is overshadowed by the devastating news that 16 American and British soldiers are dead. NBC's Carl Rochelle is at the Pentagon with more on the story. Carl?
John, it's a Sea Night CH-46 Marine Corps helicopter believed to be returning from the Iraqi area into Kuwait. It went down. It was not, we are told, enemy fire, that it perhaps was weather-related, perhaps a mechanical problem, conceivably a pilot error. There were 16 people on board. All 16 were killed. Now, the U.S. is only confirming the deaths of the U.S. personnel. British policy is that they don't confirm the death. But we are told that all 16 on board believed to be the four-person Marine Corps crew and 12 British Marines who were on board the helicopter when it went down, all killed in that tragic accident, the first casualties of the war. John, I might point out the CH-46, it's a Sea Night helicopter. It's the twin rotor, one on the front, one on the back. It is the standard Marine Corps helicopter for transporting troops on to almost any kind of location. But it's an older helicopter. It's been in the inventory for 30, perhaps even 35 or 40 years. There have been some mechanical problems in the past. They have been taken care of, supposedly, and the Marine Corps has moved forward. They'd like to replace it with newer machines, but not clear exactly how old this particular helicopter was, but we are being told that it did not go down as a result of enemy fire, and apparently not from friendly fire either, mechanical, weather-related, or possibly pilot difficulties. Again, John, all 16 on board, 4 U.S. Marines and supposedly 12 British Marines killed in that crash, John.
We could hear more on this later tonight, but what about the fate of Saddam Hussein? What are they saying about the Pentagon right now?
Well, the Pentagon is saying little about it, but I have talked to government sources about that, and they still say, even at this late hour, that they do not know for sure whether he is dead or alive. These sources said that Saddam Hussein, members of his family, and part of the leadership of the Iraqi military, some of the senior leadership, were in that bunker in Baghdad. They had a pretty good fix on it yesterday when CIA Director George Tenet went to the White House. I'd make that day before yesterday now. Went to the White House and briefed President Bush on it. They decided to target that area. I was told that they hit what they targeted with roughly 3 dozen Tomahawk cruise missiles and bombs, bunker buster bombs from 2 F-117 fighters. They are still having difficulty getting a total readout on who was killed and who wasn't. But I was told that the fact that we saw Saddam Hussein on videotape on Iraqi television is not an indication that he is still alive. John?
NBC's Carl Rochelle at the Pentagon. Carl, thank you very much. And the invasion of Iraq, of course, has begun, the ground invasion. Let's go now to NBC's David Bloom, who's with the 3rd Infantry, well into Iraq. David, generally, can you give us your location?
We can say, John, that we're in southern Iraq. That's about all that we can say. I mean, essentially what happened was around 8 o'clock last night local time, and it's now about 7:40 a.m. here in southern Iraq. We began the movement with artillery strikes. Those were followed by the artillery strikes. I should tell you, were at 2 Iraqi observation posts that they were trying to wipe out so they couldn't get word back to Baghdad as to where this large American force from the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, 250 tanks, some 20,000 soldiers was coming through. We're literally with the vanguard of this force. We're up into southern Iraq now, and other elements of the force are catching up with you. If I can ask my cameraman, Craig White. Craig, if you could pan around now. Craig's going to try to pan around with our camera here, so it might be a little bit herky-jerky on this video phone, but I want to show you what we're seeing out here. As I said, you can see some fuelers, you can see some medic vehicles, you can see Bradleys and Humvees, and you can also see a command and control station here. Basically, we're out at the lead edge of this force, and the other elements of the force are gradually coming toward us, rolling along toward us, and then they're all going to link up out here, and then they'll decide where to go in terms of what route to take to Baghdad based upon the opposition that they face, as well as based upon the possible collapse of the Iraqi regime if indeed they did successfully target Saddam Hussein. Now, I want to pass on a bit of news to you. What these soldiers are hearing on their radios, and again, I caution, it's just that, what the soldiers are hearing on their radios, is that the 11th Division of the regular Iraqi army has surrendered, has signed capitulation documents, has decided to surrender rather than fight. I mean, we should caution that that is just merely what the soldiers are hearing on the radios. There's no reason to doubt that, but I think what we can say is that it's very possible that this Iraqi armored division, which they did indeed expect to surrender, that they did not expect to fight. Remember, there are 3 regular army Iraqi divisions in southern Iraq. They've been convinced all along that those soldiers, conscripts mostly, did not have the desire to fight this American force, that they would not be the heart of the opposition that they would face. Rather, that's the Republican Guard and the Special Republican Guard. Those are the much more heavily armed forces that are encircling Baghdad. But certainly that would be good news for the American forces if one of those 3 Iraqi divisions in southern Iraq has indeed surrendered. John, back to you.
And David, we're getting the sense that, of course, that you're moving ahead a bit faster with the 3rd Infantry than had been expected. Is this all because the campaign started with the initial attack on the leadership target in Baghdad, and that meant that the ground campaign started a little sooner as well?
I think that there's no question, John, that that's the case, that they moved up the timetable for the ground invasion because not only of the fact that they had this target of opportunity, as the military says, they were calling it the pre-battle phase with these cruise missile strikes on the military leadership targets in Iraq. But in addition to that, because Iraq then responded with the Scud or El Samud missile attacks, and there were the threats of the chemical munitions perhaps being used against these forces in southern Kuwait, the commanders decided it was much better to just push this force into southern Iraq and get the ground phase of this battle going as well.
There's clearly a lot of optimism at the White House and the Pentagon tonight. David, what's the mood of the troops there?
Well, I would say that they're very upbeat for a couple reasons. First of all, because they encountered only light opposition, which is what they expected. Remember, their mission early on was to take out these 2 Iraqi observation posts, each of which contained about 30 Iraqi soldiers. They hit it with artillery first, then about half an hour later, the force that we're in right now stormed across the border, literally the first force to cross into Iraq, and they headed straight for those Iraqi observation posts to make sure that there were frankly no Iraqi soldiers there that were still alive. There were infantry forces prepared to engage them in action, but as far as we know, they did not have to do so. They've taken no casualties. At one point, we passed the smoldering remains of these Iraqi observation posts. Again, the critical thing for them was to make sure that the Iraqi soldiers did not relay back to Baghdad the position of this large mechanized infantry force moving into southern Iraq, because that might give away some details of the strategy that these forces plan to employ, because of course there are a number of different routes they could conceivably take heading up toward Baghdad. Now, as to the morale of the forces, it's also bolstered by these reports of the capitulation or surrender, at least that's what we think that it is, of this 11th Division of the Iraqi Regular Army. Well, it was not unexpected. It's still good news for these soldiers. In addition, remember, the 3rd Infantry Division has been here longer than any other forces in the Persian Gulf region. Some of these soldiers have been here now going on 6 months. As we've said repeatedly, they became convinced that the only way to go home was to get their boots and their tanks and their Bradleys into Baghdad. So the fact that this mission is now underway is in some senses a great relief. Couple that with the fact that they've faced very little opposition thus far, and they're feeling very good. John?
All right, NBC's David Bloom, who is standing by with the 3rd Infantry Division somewhere in southern Iraq. David, thank you very much. Of course, all of this being watched very closely at the White House. Let's go now to NBC's Campbell Brown, who's at the White House tonight. Campbell, bring us up to date.
Well, John, let me follow up just on what David was reporting. Administration officials earlier today had said that there was some optimism, that there were discussions going on with members of the Iraqi leadership about possible surrender. They were trying not to get too hopeful about this and not really commenting on it beyond that. But one official telling me tonight, there is nothing we would love more than to win this without a major fight. The president is in for the evening, retired to the White House residence. He is getting an evening phone call each night now from Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, giving him updates, as well as his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice. So we may know more again from White House officials tomorrow as to whether or not this initial strike on the compound where they believe Saddam may have been, along with members of his family, and whether or not these troops are indeed surrendering. I also want to give you reaction, John, to the other issue that Carl Rochelle was reporting about earlier. We've seen the White House tonight really go from feeling of being pleased with the progress they were making to being a little more restrained with the news of that helicopter crash and the sign of first American casualties in this conflict. The president had nothing public on his schedule tomorrow, but we do know he is planning to meet with congressional leaders here at the White House, and then we'll be going to Camp David for the weekend. So I wouldn't be surprised if we do, in fact, hear him offering some words to the families of those soldiers. John?
Campbell, before we go on, I just wanted to ask you one question about Saddam Hussein and what they're saying about the fate of Saddam there at the White House tonight.
Not a lot, and I think that in and of itself is worth noting because there has been very little information coming out of either the White House, the Pentagon, the State Department, or intelligence sources. All have been unified in being very cautious in their assessment. And I think clearly that signals that this would be such a major breakthrough that they don't want to get out or raise the expectations, I guess, too high or get out too far in front of themselves. So they're being very careful with their assessment. And we may not even know as early as tomorrow, but I think it'll be something for us to closely watch over the next couple of days.
All right. Campbell Brown at the White House. Campbell, thank you very much. We turn now to NBC's Dennis Murphy with more on that chopper crash, the first casualties of this war, and the rest of the day's news in Operation Iraqi Freedom from Baghdad to Washington to Kuwait City.
If yesterday felt like a rehearsal for war, today was the real thing. And tonight, there are real casualties. The first U.S. deaths in Gulf War II. Military officials tell NBC News that a U.S. Marine helicopter, a CH-46 Sea Knight, with 4 Americans and 12 British troops aboard, has crashed in Kuwait during an operation. Reports are sketchy, but it's believed there are no survivors. There were 2 other helicopter incidents today, but no one was injured in those. It was a long day of air warfare. U.S. aircraft carrier teams are working through the night, launching bomber pilots on missions over Iraq.
So they were shooting at us, but they didn't get us today.
Late tonight, there are fresh reports of huge explosions in the sky over Basra, the principal Iraqi city in the south, not far from Kuwait, and also in Mosul, a major oil city to the north, near the Kurd safe haven. Earlier this evening, parts of central Baghdad were burning out of control. A government ministry run by one of Saddam Hussein's sons, a presidential palace, a home of one of Saddam's wives, Republican Guard strongholds, all hit in a brief but ferocious assault from U.S. cruise missiles and 2,000-pound penetrating bombs. Peter Arnett, reporting for National Geographic Explorer and NBC News, described the view from his window as thunderous explosions lit up the night sky shortly after 9 p.m. Baghdad time.
Big explosion near the presidential palace. You will hear those explosions now.
It's the second attack on Baghdad in 16 hours. Missiles launched from sea. Smart bombs dropped from stealth warplanes like this one. U.S. officials said they intend to hit the apparatus of Saddam's Stalinist state like a boxer. Punch hard, step back, pause, and see if it needs another one. It's daylight now in Baghdad, and few people are coming out to look at the devastation wrought so far on pockets of their city. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said today the big violent display is just beginning.
What will follow will not be a repeat of any other conflict. It will be of a force and scope and scale that has been beyond what has been seen before.
To the south, U.S. Army howitzers slammed shell after shell into Iraq from the Kuwaiti border. And then the ground war was on. U.S. Army and Marine units are in Iraq tonight, pushing north in coordination with British troops. Some forces are coming under light fire. So far, one coastal Iraqi town has been taken. The Iraqis also fired some mortar and rockets to no effect at U.S. troops that haven't moved out yet on the Kuwaiti side. NBC's Dana Lewis with the 101st Airborne joined the soldiers as they put on gas masks, while a horn honked out a warning of another missile attack. Scenes like this were repeated many times today along the Kuwaiti front. The war began yesterday at dawn Iraqi time with the first air raid, a total fake-out, a directed lightning attempt to kill Saddam Hussein and his top leaders. Anti-aircraft fire over Baghdad was followed moments later by an orange fireball at what was described as a target of opportunity. A private home outside Baghdad where electronic intelligence gathering had eavesdropped on a meeting of top-ranking senior Iraqi military, as well as Saddam and possibly both his sons, Qusay and Uday. The compound was flattened by a barrage of cruise missiles and 2 bunker-buster bombs designed to slam into subterranean chambers and explode. A few hours later, Saddam Hussein appeared on tape on Iraqi TV denouncing the president as Bush Jr., a criminal. But some U.S. officials wondered whether the subdued man with the unfamiliar glasses, reading listlessly from a lined pad, was actually Saddam or a double. Tonight, some analysts believe this is Saddam, but think the message may have been taped before the first air raid. So the question remains, is Saddam dead or alive? As U.S.-led forces under the cover of artillery barrages make their way toward Baghdad and provincial cities, propaganda leaflets explaining to the Iraqis how to surrender are being printed and airdropped by the millions. If the Iraqis do make a stand, it is likely, military strategists think, that it will happen in Baghdad, the sprawling city of 5 million people, an ancient capital enshrouded tonight in smoke and paralyzed by a fear it's hard to imagine.
You could hear the air raid sirens in Kuwait City today, where the sun is now just coming up. And NBC's Don Teague is in Kuwait City. Don, first of all, have you had anything like the harrowing experience you had yesterday in Kuwait?
Well, unfortunately, yes. We thought those were basically over for the day, but around midnight last night, Kuwait time, the air raid siren alarms went off again. Everyone went back to the masks, and that was followed by 3 more incidents overnight. So not that you could really sleep well with what's going on in and around this country anyway, but I'm sure there were many, many sleepless nights tonight, as basically every hour was punctuated by air raid alarms throughout this city.
Talk about the precautions that are being taken there if there is a chemical or biological attack.
Well, of course, everyone who has access to them has gas masks like this one. This is the one that a standard issue for NBC. Most of the journalists here from other networks and from around the world have similar equipment, protective gear. As for the city itself, well, there are decontamination centers set up by the U.S. military, also the Kuwaiti military, and some European countries as well, with expertise in decontaminating large numbers of people and equipment if necessary. The major precaution here really is this idea of getting people to shelter, giving them advance warning if there's any sort of missile attack, and telling people to stay indoors and not come out until the all clear has sounded. And fortunately, every air raid siren has been followed by an all clear within a few minutes.
Don, what's the assessment there of the performance of the Patriot missiles when Iraqi missiles were fired into Kuwait yesterday for you?
Well, you know, it's a source of a lot of discussion before all of this happened here in Kuwait. In particular, that was the hope, was that they would provide protection for the 2 million people who live here. That seems to be the case. What the U.S. military is saying is confirming that at least 3 incoming missiles were fired from Iraq. It's still unclear exactly which type of missiles those were, but the military is saying that at least 2 of them were shot down by Patriot missiles. They are confirming that another one of those missiles, the inbound missiles from Iraq, came down in the desert near an area of U.S. troops. We haven't been able to determine if it was shot down or if it came down on its own or perhaps broke apart. But even if it's 2 out of 3, that seems to be better odds than in 1991 when, as we learned after the fact, the Patriots weren't as effective as advertised.
Well, we wish you a quiet day in Kuwait there. Don Teague reporting. Don, we'll talk to you a little later. Now, all day and into the night, we've seen the pictures and the explosions in the skies over Baghdad and heard the sounds of the furious and focused bombing campaign going on there and all across Iraq. What's it like to live through attacks like that? Well, NBC's John Hockenberry has been listening to the voices from Iraq.
A city in night vision green and thunder. To observers thousands of miles away, Baghdad sits under an angry sky tonight, as it did 12 years ago. As they did then, the voices from Baghdad must speak over explosions. Some of those voices are familiar.
Multiple anti-aircraft bursts.
Reporter Peter Arnett, back at his well-known perch atop a Baghdad hotel.
Now we hear the sounds of aircraft low over the city. Aircraft low over the city. Big explosion near the presidential palace. You will hear those explosions now.
But there are other voices from other parts of a nation under attack.
It's a symphony of various sounds.
New York Times reporter Dexter Filkins in southern Iraq, looking for and finding shock and awe.
I was in Afghanistan for the war there, and I have to say that this makes Afghanistan seem almost like a tea party. The amount of firing that's going on here just exceeds that by an order of magnitude. It's just extraordinary.
Reporters in Baghdad like Neil Connery of ITN News watch and wait, seeking safety to witness history.
Then we heard at least 2 explosions, massive explosions. There is a building I can see now still on fire, all floors, flames coming out from all floors of that building.
There's reporter Lindsay Hilsum, who speaks of a city poised and pausing between attacks.
I wouldn't say it was exactly deserted, and I think many people are staying home.
And many of those ordinary Iraqis wondering, is the worst, as the Pentagon insists, really yet to come?
I think people were rather surprised. They thought, oh, this is going to be it. We're going to feel like the whole world is falling down on our heads. But it wasn't like that, certainly not in the center of Baghdad.
But perhaps it was like the whole world falling down to one voice. The mother of all Baghdad voices, Saddam Hussein himself, bunkered down, knowing that every rumble and fiery explosion is looking for him. From somewhere, perhaps near Baghdad, he taunts President Bush. And he insists he hasn't been silenced. Yet.
As we mentioned, the ground invasion of Iraq has begun in force. Joining us now, Vice Admiral Dennis McGinn, NBC News military analyst. And Admiral, let's start with what we know and what we don't know about this ground invasion.
I think that's really key, John, because what we do know is what we are getting from people on the ground and some television cameras up here in the vicinity of Baghdad. Mostly the effects, but not in a detailed way, of some of those strikes by Tomahawk missiles and manned aircraft. What we know is down along the border of Kuwait and Iraq, also reported by people on the ground, embedded journalists, and also from observations from camera gear down there. What we don't know is what's going on out here in the western part of Iraq, what is happening inside the city limits, any other types of special operations force activities. We've got to remember that there are basically 4 campaigns going on. There's a special operations campaign in which covertness is absolutely essential to success. There's an air campaign, which we've talked about quite a lot. The ground campaign, which is getting underway, apparently very successful down here in the southern part of Iraq. And then finally, the psychological operations campaign.
Well, let's talk about the southern part of Iraq there. Are you surprised by the lack of Iraqi opposition?
I'm really not. I don't think the key centers of gravity that the Iraqi regime, such as they are, and that still is uncertain, are willing to defend down here. There's been a lot of discussion about the divisions within the various sections of Iraq, and I believe that the expectation, and appropriately so, was that in the southern part of Iraq there would be the least amount of opposition.
It is sounding again tonight like it's still a possibility that the U.S. may have gotten Saddam Hussein. What do you make of all this?
I think that it could be a possibility, but I think that the commander, General Franks, and his great team out there are going to go with the assumption that the campaign timelines need to proceed as planned. They need to seize opportunity as it presents itself in the southern part of Iraq, take as many key critical nodes of transportation, the city of Basra, for example, communication, and then also to encounter whatever Iraqi resistance there may be. At the same time, continuing the attacks against key leadership, command and control, and communications up in the north.
Seems to be going well.
Absolutely. That's my assessment, John.
All right, Admiral. Thanks very much. We'll talk a little later. Now, it became a household name during the last Gulf War, the Patriot missile. At that time, it was a new and, according to the Pentagon, pinpoint-accurate missile defense system. But it never quite lived up to its reputation. A new and improved version is back. Is it ready for round two? Here's Rob Stafford.
These are the Patriots, designed to shoot down and destroy incoming Iraqi missiles, which might be carrying chemical or biological agents. And today, when Saddam Hussein fired at U.S. troops in Kuwait, the Patriots were called to action. U.S. officials say they hit their targets.
2 missiles have landed in Kuwait this morning.
Yeah, Scud. Okay, we see the Scud.
In the last Gulf War, at first, the Patriot was touted as a stunning success.
42 Scuds engaged, 41 intercepted.
You have to rebuild the house.
Others thought it was not the defender the government hoped it would be. It turned out the Patriot often exploded without hitting its target. It didn't stop missiles bound for Israel. And it was a Patriot that failed to stop the incoming Scud that hit this Army barracks, killing 28 American soldiers. Phil Coyle is the former Assistant Secretary of Defense. He headed all Pentagon weapons testing from 1994 to 2001. He says the new Patriot, which has undergone a massive redesign, is better.
The latest version of the Patriot, so-called PAC-3, is faster than the old Patriot. It's a very fast missile. It has better guidance and control systems than the old one did. And it has a wonderful radar, a very special radar that has great range and resolution power.
Coyle says in testing, the upgraded Patriots hit their targets 45% of the time, but they've never been used before in combat until now.
The war in Iraq came before the Army had completed the test program with real Scud missiles.
How they continue to perform could mean the difference between life and death, not only for the soldiers in the Gulf, but also for the people of Kuwait, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Israel, and Jordan.
Even though the Patriot isn't perfect, it will definitely be better than nothing.
It's Rob Stafford. Now, the State Department got some welcome news from Turkey today, but is it too little too late? NBC News correspondent George Lewis is in Turkey with more on that story. George?
John, Turkey's parliament approved the overflight rights that the U.S. was looking for its planes, so that U.S. planes operating off of carriers in the Mediterranean and out of Europe could fly directly over Turkey into northern Iraq. The question you raise, whether it's too little, too late, remains to be seen. The U.S. progress in Iraq has been so rapid. The question now is, will the approval by Parliament of the Turkish airspace do much good? The answer is probably yes, because what the U.S. needs to do is ferry large numbers of troops into northern Iraq once airfields are secured there, so that it can keep the peace. There's been a very tense situation in northern Iraq between the Turks and the Kurds. The U.S. wants troops on the ground to kind of stabilize that situation. John?
Give me an idea of what the mood is in Turkey with regard to the United States, George, now.
We have been talking to a number of people around this town where we are in Diyarbakir, in eastern Turkey, and in other cities, and the mood is almost uniform. The Turks do not want war, but now that it's begun, they seem resigned to the fact that Turkey should participate. Turkey has been a long ally of the United States, a 50-year relationship in NATO. The Turks feel that they need to go along with the U.S. on this now that the war has begun.
All right, NBC's George Lewis in Turkey. George, we'll get back to you a little later as well. We have word tonight about an al-Qaeda suspect and a worldwide alert. NBC's Pete Williams reports on that from Washington.
As the police and National Guard fan out nationwide to protect potential terror targets, the FBI tonight is urgently seeking their help in finding a man believed to be a top al-Qaeda operative who could be in the U.S. He's identified as Adnan G. El Shukrit Juma, 27 years old, around 5.5 feet tall, speaks fluent English, and as medic, he uses an inhaler. Investigators believe he's another Mohammed Atta, the key planner in the 9/11 attacks. And even more worrisome, he's believed to be a trained pilot. One of his Arabic nicknames is Jafar the Pilot. FBI agents today searched this house in Miramar, Florida, Shukrit Juma's last known address, questioning his parents. Agents believe he was in the United States after 9/11, but they don't know where he is now. His brother, Nidal, says Shukrit Juma is no terrorist.
Is he a pilot?
No.
No? Did he go to flight school here? No.
Even so, captured al-Qaeda members have told U.S. interrogators that Shukrit Juma would be central to the planning for any further terror attacks against Americans, either here or overseas. In Arizona, meantime, extra security was deployed to the Palo Verde power plant near Phoenix, the nation's largest nuclear generator, a response officials say to a specific threat.
It was obviously serious enough and deemed to be credible enough that we've got several the appropriate federal agencies investigating.
Tonight, officials say that threat now appears less credible. In the Northeast today, police and National Guardsmen from 3 states rode commuter trains and subways into New York, concerned that mass transit could be a target.
We have close to 4,000 New York State National Guard troops deployed everywhere from the subways of New York to the borders of Canada.
In Los Angeles, Mayor James Hahn inspected the city's water supply, where testing and security are both up.
Hundreds of tests being performed, make sure that if anything does contaminate the water supply, we know about it instantly.
That was the south side of 108.
Washington, D.C. put its police officers on 12-hour shifts, and signs went up from Homeland Security with a number to use for calling in tips. And nationwide, extra security was especially visible at airports. Traffic backed up for half an hour this morning at Seattle-Tacoma as the National Guard searched cars. Cities and states determined to prevent acts of terror.
Now, America's attack in Iraq is sparking outrage around the world. Today, French President Jacques Chirac warned that the conflict will have serious consequences for the future. Russia's President Vladimir Putin called it a big political mistake. Thousands demonstrated against the U.S. decision to fight, and there's anger here at home. NBC's Rob Stafford again followed one man's experience as he made his feelings known.
A cry for peace at a time of war. Throughout the day and across the country, thousands of anti-war demonstrators took to the streets.
It finally hits home that this has started and that war is underway.
In New York, under pouring rain, Max Uhlenbeck was rallying his troops for a battle he seemingly lost. A student coordinator in the anti-war movement, he and others have spent months trying to prevent the strike on Iraq.
Now that the war is here, what is the biggest way to protest?
I think what we have to continue doing and what we've been doing is we have to keep coming out on the streets.
These are bilingual?
Yeah. Planning today's protest started last night as the first missiles were launched. This is the headquarters of United for Peace and Justice, an organization that says it's coordinating hundreds of thousands of peace activists around the nation.
If this happens tonight, if it looks like that the bombs are going to start to drop this evening.
As the hours ticked away towards the president's deadline last night, Max and other activists contemplated how best to respond to a war now imminently here.
40 protesters arrested in New York today, many more around the country. Is this upping the ante?
Sure, I think it's definitely upping the ante, and the ante will continue to be raised every single day from now on.
Is it too little too late?
It's never too little too late.
Indeed, today, over 500 protesters were arrested in San Francisco, 100 in Philadelphia. And around the country, many skipped school, blocked office buildings and roads in civil disobedience.
Not much sleep the last 12 hours, obviously.
Max spent all night on the phone making sure all these people come today.
Hey, listen, have you gotten status on Times Square yet?
And he's still on the phone.
You know, it's a few hundred people.
Max believes that the start of the war should spur Americans into more protest.
How old are you?
I'm 23 years old.
What do you say to the 23-year-old American soldier who's putting his life on the line tonight?
We're all Americans, we're all people. I don't think anybody wants to die unnecessarily. I see this very much as fighting a fight for them. If we were to stop this war, it would mean saving a lot of American lives.
Is it unpatriotic to be protesting this war at a time when American soldiers are in harm's way?
Certainly not. I think dissent and demonstrating and voicing your opinion and articulating a position is definitely the highest form of patriotism, I think.
With that in mind, tonight Max marched to a New York landmark, made famous by the end of a war, to protest the beginning of this new one.
We are telling the president, do not act in our name. This is not what we want.
From protests in this country, we turn now to Israel, and Israel has been on high alert for days now. Israelis have been told to keep their gas masks with them at all times. With the war going into its second full day, what's the situation there now? NBC's Martin Fletcher is in Israel tonight. Martin?
John, the Israelis are just waking up this morning. They're going to find the news of what's been happening in Iraq and Kuwait. And the fear here, of course, is that will it happen here? Will Israel become the victim of Iraqi Scuds? So far, the mood's pretty even, though. The people are just going around their daily lives, told by the government to continue as normal. Of course, what passes as normal here would be pretty weird elsewhere. Everyone's carrying gas masks with them. They've been told by the government to do that in case they're surprised. They should get a maximum of about 6 minutes warning if if a Scud is fired from Iraq. 150,000 people changed their gas masks yesterday, showing how people do leave things till the last minute. But many people are walking in the streets without their gas masks. They say, well, it probably won't happen. Things have been worse in the past, and Israel is just trying to continue life as normal, John.
How would you compare, Martin, the war now compared to the Gulf War back in '91 in Israel?
Well, yeah, sure. Well, I was here, of course, and the clear difference, of course, is that then 39 Scuds rained down upon Israel with regular conventional warheads. Nothing's happened so far. Right now, this is a country that is simply waiting for the worst, hoping it doesn't happen. And as the Prime Minister said, he said there's only a 1% chance or so that anything will happen. But Israel, he said, is 100% ready. You know, if there is a chemical attack, one security expert said to me, if it's going to happen anywhere, this is the place to be, because Israel really is ready. You know, you go to the hospitals here in Tel Aviv, there are hundreds of beds outside on the streets waiting to receive anybody that gets hurt. They've got showers in the streets ready to decontaminate citizens if they get hit by a chemical attack. Nobody would go inside the hospital until they've been decontaminated. Everybody has been told what to do. It's a nation that is really ready for the worst, knows what to do in general. Of course, if it really happens, we know people in this situation bound to panic, but Israel in general is ready as it can be, John.
Martin Fletcher in Israel. Martin, thank you very much. And joining us now from Israel is Iraq expert and NBC News analyst Amatzia Barome. He heads the Middle Eastern History Department at the University of Haifa and is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. Professor, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning, John.
Now, you predicted that Saddam Hussein wouldn't accept asylum to avoid war. Now, with the U.S. attack on Baghdad, what course do you see Saddam taking if he is alive?
Yeah, if he is alive. I think that right now Saddam has proved to us that he sticks to his guns in a sense. He sticks to his plan A. Plan A is to play the role of an innocent victim. And when you play the role of an innocent victim, you cannot push the buttons of chemical tipped missiles towards Israel, because that's not a victim. And you cannot use Scuds anyway, because Scuds are prohibited by the UN. Now, the scenario of Plan A is that Saddam needs to provide as many civilian casualties as possible for the consumption, for the benefit of the international television networks. He relies heavily on the help of demonstrators like the young man we have seen just here, very impressive, and demonstrate in America and in Europe, anti-war Western, if you wish, circles, if you wish, lobby. He hopes that if the war takes longer than the Americans are planning, and if the civilian casualties are higher than the Americans are planning not to have any, of course, if they're high, then large parts of the community in the Western world will force Americas to stop the war. So that's plan A, and right now that's what he is banking all his hope on. There is plan B and plan C, but certainly plan A is now fully fledged, in front of you. And the fact that Israel hasn't absorbed even one missile last night is a proof of that. I'd only say more. If one more night we don't see any missiles coming here, then I would say it's almost certain there will be no missiles on Israel at all.
A lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty about Saddam Hussein right now. We still don't know the question about whether or not he's alive or dead. Amatzia Barom, our thanks to you in Israel. Now, it would not be enough for Saddam Hussein just to leave the country. You'll remember President Bush included his two sons in the 48-hour ultimatum as well. And here's why. Experts will tell you that the sons of Saddam are as feared and are as ruthless as the Iraqi leader himself. They've achieved their own special notoriety. Apparently, to know them is to fear them. Here's NBC's Hoda Kotb.
These are the faces of the next generation of terror. They are Saddam Hussein's sons. Uday, age 38, is a powerful member of parliament. Qusay, age 36, the leader of Saddam's military.
Saddam's sons are as dangerous as Saddam, and the sons have the potential to be even more dangerous than their father.
Con Coughlin is a British journalist and author of a new book, Saddam, King of Terror. He says the sons will play a key role in how this war unfolds.
Even at this late stage, I think Saddam and his sons believe that they can survive the current crisis.
Saddam's sons have spent a lifetime learning lessons on how to survive from their father. Uday was born in 1964, the first of Saddam's 5 children, with his wife Sajida. Coughlin says Uday's political education began early when Saddam was locked away in jail for trying to overthrow a rival party government.
His wife used to smuggle messages to him from his party colleagues in Uday's diaper. And from that moment, Uday was involved in the politics of Iraq.
In 1979, when Saddam seized power as president of Iraq, Uday was 15, but his reputation for violence was already well known. In high school, he reportedly beat his teachers and principal. In his early 20s, when he became head of the Iraqi Olympic Committee, the prestigious post became an outlet for Uday's growing ruthlessness. When the Iraqi soccer team lost an important match, the players learned the price for displeasing Uday.
They're all beaten severely on the soles of their feet, so that in some cases they couldn't walk for months.
As Uday's power grew, he became more brutal and out of control.
Uday is a deranged psychopath who has a great capacity for violence.
Over the years, much of that violence was directed toward women. There are reports of Uday snatching women from the streets, then raping and murdering them.
I am very sure that he lured some women in order to rape them.
Few people know Uday as well as Abbas el-Janabi. He was Uday's assistant for 15 years until he fled Iraq 5 years ago. He and others describe Uday as a serial rapist.
And this is not, only 1 or 2 or 3 times. This is regular in his life.
No one was exempt from Uday's cruelty. In 1988, he bludgeoned to death one of Saddam's closest aides, a man he believed had insulted his mother's honor. Years later, he even carried out murders against members of his own family. In 1995, 2 of Udai's brothers-in-law defected to Jordan. There, one of them revealed secrets about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Saddam lured them home, and Udai and his brother orchestrated their deaths.
They launched basically a military attack on the house with rocket launchers, grenades, heavy machine guns. They killed the sons-in-law, the father, and all the other relatives that were in the house. It was basically a massacre.
But that very same year, something happened that would alter the line of succession in Iraq. Assassins attacked Udai, shooting him numerous times. The attack left him partially paralyzed and some say even more unstable. Udai had become a liability for Saddam. The Iraqi dictator would still allow him to play an important role in the government, but Saddam reluctantly decided that Udai's brother, Qusay, would be a better choice as the future ruler of Iraq. At 36, just 2 years younger than Udai, relatively little is known about Qusay, but by all accounts, he is just as dangerous as his brother. Udai's former assistant says he closely observed Qusay and agrees when it comes to violence, there is little difference between Saddam's sons.
They are a copy, they are the same.
Iraqi experts say in this war, Qusay commands a force of at least 100,000 soldiers and intelligence officers loyal to Saddam. He is also responsible for protecting his father and his inner circle. Some say getting rid of Saddam is not enough.
We don't want a position where his sons could replace him. They are as tarnished as their father, they are as dangerous as their father, and they have to be taken out in the same way their father has to be taken out.
We return now to the ground invasion and the front line, and let's go back to NBC's David Bloom, who's with the 3rd Infantry. And David, give us an update.
Well, John, I just wanted to introduce you briefly to one of the stars of the U.S. Army. His name is Sergeant Major Bob Gallagher, and he's the one of the executive officers here as far as leading this force, this task force. And we're again with the 3rd Infantry Division, which is the lead element here. We're literally at the front lines in southern Iraq, waiting for the rest of the force to catch up with us. Sergeant Major Gallagher, how's the mission going so far? Great. Tell us about the opposition, the very light opposition you faced. Their mission at first was to take out 2 Iraqi observation posts with about 30 soldiers apiece in it because you didn't want them to relay messages back to Baghdad as to where you were coming in. So tell me, walk me through that. How did that take place?
It went according to our plan. Pretty smooth. Wasn't anything that we didn't expect.
We heard the reports on the radio about Iraqi Army division surrendering, the 11th Army Division, one of the 3 Iraqi Army divisions in southern Iraq. If those reports, and we're saying when radio is military radio, if those reports are accurate, and we have no reason to believe that they're not, that's a good sign?
It'd probably be a wise thing for them to do.
And you can hear Trinity McLean, one of the other soldiers here, laughing about that because, clearly there's a sense, John, of optimism among these soldiers. They've faced only light opposition thus far. To the extent that there's heavy Iraqi opposition up closer to Baghdad, encircling Baghdad, they may confront that in the days to come. But as they say, so far so good for these soldiers on the vanguard of the U.S. movement into southern Iraq. John?
All right, David Bloom reporting with the 3rd Infantry in southern Iraq. David, thank you very much, and thanks to your guests as well. Now, they've grown up with the pretend violence of video games, but they have actually, before we do that story, let's do Colonel Charles Benson, Jr. He is the commander of the Air Force Weather Agency. And Colonel Benson, welcome. Thanks for being with us. Let's talk about the weather forecasting, how essential it is to this whole process.
Well, it's very essential, especially for the planning of military operations. And what we do is try to make sure the combat forces that are in theater have the very latest weather information, can use that to anticipate the weather trends and use that in the planning factors for mission execution.
Well, how's the weather been so far, and how's the forecasting, do you think, based on what you've seen, really helped make this operation work?
Well, I think it's been helpful. There were some serious problems with sand and suspended dust in the air yesterday. I think that's been pretty widely reported. But I think that was anticipated. We've had pretty good luck anticipating the dust and sand events based on numerical weather prediction models and also high-resolution satellite imagery. So I think we've been fairly successful in anticipating when those events are going to happen. And the good news is it looks like the winds are going to lighten up over the next 2 to 3 days, and the chances of that happening over the weekend are probably diminished.
It doesn't look like they've had entirely clear skies over Baghdad during some of these bombing operations, though, has it?
No, there's been some scattered clouds. There's been some scattered high and middle clouds, and I would not be surprised if that continues over the next day or two, but we don't expect it to be widespread in the sense that it would cover the entire country. But there will be some middle and high clouds passing through from time to time.
What's the forecast for the next few days?
The next few days we anticipate again, some scattered clouds, and there may be some restricted visibility due to dust and haze in some areas, but it won't be anything like that we saw yesterday. And I think as we get into the weekend, the winds are going to continue to lighten up, and the visibilities ought to stay pretty good. And the next opportunity for that to go back down as far as visibilities would be sometime early next week. But next 72 hours look fairly good.
Again, Colonel Charles L. Benson is with the U.S. Air Force Weather Agency. Colonel Benson, thanks for being with us. Now, they've grown up with the pretend violence of video games, but they have no real memory of war. How are U.S. teens reacting to this war? NBC's Josh Mankiewicz went to one high school to find out.
Let me see a show of hands. How many of you think the United States is doing the right thing by getting involved in this war? They are high school seniors, quite literally tomorrow's leaders. This is Ms. Hall's fifth period government class at Fairfax High in LA.
So I just feel that if the war was really needed, that the whole UN would agree with each other to do it.
How many of you think we're going to win? They were only 5 and 6 when the bombs fell on Iraq in 1991. More than a decade later, these well-informed students believe the U.S. will triumph this time as well. But they're not sure our president is making us safer. How many of you think that there's going to be terrorism here in the United States as a result of our starting this war? So what's the answer? Do you allow him to sort of stay in power because you're afraid of the effect of taking him out of power?
If we win, and Saddam Hussein is taken out of power, and we don't get no terrorist attacks, and the outcome is good. But if we do, then we have a serious problem.
So we're just supposed to take that type of risk?
So we just have to take the chance, and that's what Bush is doing.
There's no draft anymore, but how many of you would sign up for the military?
If I have the chance to take part in, making history and saving my country, saving my family, my friends, and the ones I love, I'll go for it. I'll do it straight up.
But he was the exception. If you're looking for dreamy idealism, don't look here. Most of these students are as distrustful of the president's motives as most Americans are of Saddam Hussein. More than a few think this war is about oil and Mr. Bush's image.
I think it's more about oil than anything else because oil is what we want and what we need.
How many of you think there's a connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda?
I don't feel that Iraq is a real threat to us. And if we were going to war because Iraq was a threat, then why aren't we going to war with North Korea? They're the real threat. That, to me, ruins the whole argument.
They also don't trust us. How many of you think that we in the news media give you the straight story about what's happening over there? No one.
I think the press leads the charge in every war. I mean, propaganda is always something that, fuels the fire.
And they think the first President Bush and President Clinton should have finished this job a long time ago.
10 years ago, when Saddam Hussein actually attacked Kuwait and started killing his people, that's when we found out that he was a brutal dictator. We could have finished him off then. We could have, made him step out then. Why did we stop?
And now, a generation that has never known a world without MTV has a televised war as a new and perhaps enduring fact of life.
It's really happening, and it's kind of scary.
And that's our report for tonight on this second war in Iraq. For the latest developments in this fast-breaking story, there is continuing coverage on cable on MSNBC and on the internet at msnbc.com. I'm John Siegenthaler reporting from New York. And for all of us here and overseas at NBC News, good night.
And to our viewers in the East Coast, good morning. I'm Lester Holt. Here is the latest in Operation Iraqi Freedom. U.S.-led forces continue their ground assault from Kuwait into Iraq after a series of artillery barrages. British troops have stormed the Al Faw Peninsula at the head of the Persian Gulf. It's a key route for oil tanker traffic. Meanwhile, huge explosions heard near the southern Iraq city of Basra. U.S. intelligence believes Saddam Hussein and possibly both his sons were in fact inside the Baghdad compound struck by American missiles early Thursday morning Iraqi time. It is not clear if the Iraqi leader was injured or killed. Also, American officials believe that the videotape of Saddam Hussein broadcast after the strike may have been recorded prior to the attack. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld confirmed Thursday that the U.S. was in touch with Iraqi forces, including members of Saddam Hussein's elite Republican Guard, over how to surrender without a fight. NBC News is hearing preliminary reports of wide-scale surrender by elite Iraqi forces. Stay tuned to MSNBC for further details. We want to remind you, we recap the latest headlines on the Iraq crisis every 15 minutes at the top of the hour, 15 after, on the half hour and quarter of the hour, right here on MSNBC. You can also log on to our website, iraq.msnbc.com, for complete coverage, as well as the Target Iraq Interactive Library. There's in-depth analysis, a slideshow, and video. It'll help you as we all walk through this together, this uncharted territory of America at war in Iraq. It's all at iraq.msnbc.com. Carl Rochelle is at the Pentagon tonight, where we're still processing news of the first coalition casualties in this war aboard a Marine helicopter that went down. Carl, what can you tell us about that?
Lester, I can tell you, unfortunately and quite sadly, apparently all 16 people on board that helicopter died in the crash. It was a CH-46 Sea Knight transport helicopter with the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, which is out of Camp Pendleton, California. There was a 4-person Marine Corps crew on board. We believe the other 12 were all British, either Marine or British troops of some nature. The Brits do not, in fact, confirm casualties, but we are told that all 16 people on board that helicopter went down. It was in Kuwait, apparently on its way back into Kuwait from Iraq, where it was ferrying the British troops when it went down. No indication of enemy fire involved with it, nor indication of friendly fire, blue on blue, if you will, to use the military term for it. It likely is an accident caused by either mechanical failure, it could be weather, it could be pilot error. It is a terribly unforgiving environment, flying around in the sand, and it's difficult to see, and the sand does wear away on the equipment inside, the working innards, if you will, of the helicopter, the engine, and all of the control surfaces as it works around in that very fine, powdery type sand that is so outstanding in that area. So it did go down, the loss of all life on board. We do not have identification of those killed because of the notification of next of kin, Lester.
All right, Carl Rochelle at the Pentagon with that sad news. Carl, thank you very much. Earlier this evening, we got some extraordinary pictures from on the front lines in southern Iraq. 2 NBC News correspondents traveling with separate units who made it through the night into southern Iraq. I had a chance to speak with Kerry Sanders. He was with the 2nd Battalion of the 8th Marines. David Bloom with the 3rd Infantry Division, and General Norman Schwarzkopf was all a part of that conversation. Let's play it for you now.
We left from the Kuwaiti side of the border around 8:30 local time, around 12:30 in the afternoon, New York time, but that was preceded by about a half hour of artillery shelling on 2 Iraqi observation posts. They were trying to destroy those observation posts and the 30 or so Iraqi soldiers who were inside each of those observation posts, because they wanted to make sure that they could not relay information back to Baghdad as to the precise location of this large movement by the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division. That was followed by us moving into Iraq. We crossed the Kuwaiti berm, which is about a 30-foot high wall of sand that had been cut through. Then we cut through electrical fences, and then we were onto the Iraqi side through a berm on the Iraqi side, which is also about 30 feet high. I can't tell, Tom, exactly what video you're seeing right now, obviously, but in addition to that, we went through minefields, and we also went through unexploded ordnance from the First Persian Gulf War. And what you may see are these orange or yellow or green lights, which allow us to make a track through there safely that the scouts had laid down so that these vehicles, which were the first vehicles to go through, could move through safely. So, Tom, right now we're into southern Iraq. We're with the, as I say, the 2nd Brigade, the Spartan Brigade of the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division. We're also with what's called the 315 Infantry, which are mostly the Bradleys and a tank platoon as well, carrying infantrymen who are out ahead, leading the charge, if you will, for the other larger mechanized units to follow on. Tom?
You're listening to David Bloom as he talks to Tom Brokaw in our New York studios. Again, David with the lead elements of the 3rd Infantry Division making his way now into southern Iraq and describing in great detail some of the obstacles they had to make their way through, including landmines being marked by scouts, and so far meeting no resistance as they begin the push into southern Iraq. Let's bring back General Norman Schwarzkopf. General, thanks for your patience. Listening to that report, the fact they have not met any resistance of any kind, does that foretell what may lie in the future of this campaign?
Yeah, very possibly. You know, some of these units, although they're good units, aren't prepared to have a really tough fight. We ran into a lot of cases in Desert Storm where they fired about 1 or 2 shots and then took off to the rear as fast as they possibly could. The unit that the 3rd ID is going up against is supposed to be a very good unit. But that's by Iraqi standards, so it'll be interesting to see what happens if they ever close on them.
You say a very good unit. That would be a regular Army unit?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
And then at what point would they expect to encounter Republican Guard, the elite troops?
Well, the information we had quite some time ago was that all the Republican Guard had been pulled back very, very closely into the Baghdad area to protect that area and be under command of Republican Guard generals. So I would expect that it'll be a while before they get into Basra probably pretty easily. But as far as going into Baghdad, that's another story.
Is it a pretty predictable route that they will take to Baghdad, or is there some flexibility to have still some element of surprise on any road march north?
No, I don't think there'll be any element of surprise. I think it's going to be a direct shot. Once Basra is sustained, and then they're going to turn around and head straight for Baghdad.
Just overwhelming firepower then.
Right, and we got great mobility. You know, as I've been saying all along, you got to have logistics follow-up. The logistical tail wags the operational dog, particularly with these armored units. So you have huge quantities of gasoline that you have to bring up to refuel them. You've got huge quantities of ammunition if they get into a big fight. Just to give you an idea, when we sent the units out west for the Hail Mary, we had to build up some log bases. We had to send 36,000 gallons of fuel out there and 115 tons of ammunition just so that they could follow the troops and resupply them if necessary.
General, I know that generals have to make casualty estimates as they prepare a war plan. Tonight, a Marine chopper went down, 12 Britons, 4 Americans. What is it like as the person in charge of a command? You know you will lose people, but when you get that first report?
There's never, you know, some people use the term satisfactory losses. As far as I was concerned, there is absolutely no such thing as a satisfactory loss. The loss of one human life is one too many. Regrettably, in war, that's going to happen, and that's why once you're committed to battle, you want to get the war over as fast as possible, because that's one way of reducing your own casualties. But nonetheless, your heart goes out to those families that have just lost their loved ones.
General, I'll ask your indulgence here. We're going to go back to David Bloom. In fact, if we'll keep you in the conversation, if you'd like to ask him some questions. David, are you with us?
I can hear you.
Good. David, give us another account of how you made your way into Iraq.
What happened was around 8 o'clock local time, which is noon Eastern time, 9 o'clock in the morning on the West Coast. this unit, the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, began shelling with artillery shells, the Paladins, huge 150 millimeter howitzer artillery. They began shelling 2 Iraqi observation posts just across onto the Iraqi side of the border, because they wanted to take out those 2 observation posts, which had about 30 Iraqi soldiers each in the observation posts, because they didn't want them to relay word back to Baghdad as to where these soldiers from the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division were crossing into southern Iraq. Now, after that happened, we then started moving, and we're with the Spartan Brigade, the 2nd Brigade, and the lead infantry unit, which is the 315 Infantry. These guys are literally the tip of the spear. We're out right now farther than any other American forces, or at least certainly any other Army forces, out here in the desert of Iraq. What they did was they first moved across the Kuwaiti berm. There had already been bulldozed holes cut in that berm. It's about 30 feet high. Then they moved across into through an electrical fence. There had been, basically large sections cut out of the electrical fence to allow the tanks and the Bradleys to sweep through, to roll through. And then we crossed through the Iraqi berm, and again, they'd already bulldozed through the hole in the Iraqi berm, which allowed us to get into the Iraqi side. Then we were on the Iraqi side, and we confronted a number of obstacles. Minefields, first of all, which the Iraqis had laid, but which the Americans had cleared a path through and had placed out lights. Basically, you may see in some of this video, some of these lights, orange lights, yellow lights, green lights, which allow them to safely travel through those Iraqi minefields, which have been cleared by the bulldozing and the anti-mine equipment. Then after that, we went through an area of ordnance. Basically, it's an area of unexploded ordnance from the first Persian Gulf War, where there were American warplanes that dropped on Iraqi tanks. We saw the charred remains of the T-72 Iraqi tanks, the BMPs, which are the Iraqi armored personnel carriers, again, from 12 years ago, from the first Gulf War. We wound our way through there, and then we came out into the open desert. Now, we have not encountered any Iraqi opposition, save for the forces which were at those observation posts, which were they not wiped out, frankly, by the Iraqi artillery, they were taken out by the U.S. infantry soldiers, who then moved in. We're right now the vanguard of the 3rd Infantry Division, and the other forces will be flowing through these 2 lanes now into southern Iraq to make their movement further north toward Baghdad.
And David, as we look at your picture, I'm told we also have Kerry Sanders I want to bring in, and producer's going to have to tell me of which unit Kerry is with. David, you'll stand by.
I can tell you, Marine.
Okay, Kerry, tell me who you're with, and roughly, to the extent you can, where you are.
We're with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, and really can't say too much other than to say that if you've been watching the reports from David Bloom, we're not too far away from David Bloom. The Marines have suited up this morning, and they've put on what they call their mop gear. As a matter of fact, in a short period of time, a deadline's going to approach, and we also have to do the same. That is the charcoal-lined suit that is designed as protection against chemical and biological agents in the event that there is an attack. There were at least 3 incidents yesterday when the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines were moving, where they had to at least don their gas masks. They did this as they were traveling in some rather dusty and particularly hot conditions, which made it, for myself, extremely uncomfortable.
What's that?
I can tell you that the masks, when you put them on, initially begin to cause your face to sweat quite a bit. So it was quite an ordeal. In all 3 cases yesterday, it was information that was bogus, as it were. They were just relying on the preventative approach to this. On the side of the trucks, they actually have equipment that tests and smells the air to see if there is any sort of chemical or biological agent, a sniffer, as it were. What I'm going to try to do here is I'm going to try and just give you a small picture. As much as I can't tell you where I am, I can try to provide you a little bit of a picture of what you can see out here. So let me just step out of the picture for a moment, okay? And I'm going to let you look past us just here for a moment. And you can see here, this is one of the command tents that's been set up. These can be set up in about 5 to 10 minutes in the field here by the Marines. And as we come back over this way, you can see some of the other elements that are also here. I'm going to also provide you a picture, if I can, and I'm sorry this is taking a little bit difficult, but we're going to sort of bring the camera all the way around here if we can. and we're in sort of a tight condition here. And I want to show you, this is what they call the CAT patrol. That's the folks who go out sort of as the screen in front of moving troops. And what you see right there are tow missiles on top of Humvees. And you can see that they're camouflaged. They've hardened the floors with sandbags. And the patrol that goes out would, if they move in a direction, would be right out there in front. It would sort of be the blockers on a football team, as it were. And you can see some of the units here. And again, you see everybody in their chemical, biological suits this morning. Now, we do have some news to report. There is apparently a battle for the Ramallah oil fields. We understand that at least 2 of the oil fields are on fire. I can report that we did see a glow that appeared to be those Ramallah oil fields at one point yesterday. There is also a report of a Black Hawk helicopter that is down. We do not have any information of known casualties or not. And finally, we can tell you that hiding in amongst the scrapyards of the old tanks that were dumped and left in the desert after the first Gulf War 12 years ago are T-72 tanks. The Iraqi military apparently has moved some of those tanks from their present-day military in to hide in amongst there. We know at least one T-72 tank has been taken out when it was firing. And finally, last night, a tremendous light show here, just a tremendous light show as we were watching the multiple launch rocket systems fire off in the desert here. Those rockets, of course, heading north. I think we may have some pictures of those. It was a continual firing throughout the night, so many that, in fact, we lost count. Lester?
Kerry, I'm going to ask you to stand by. I want to quickly go back to David Bloom. David, are you allowed to have your camera pan around? And as we do that, I want to ask you about the landmines. Were they more than the commanders expected, and will that continue to be an obstacle that will make you have to pick your way as you move north?
Okay, I'm going to ask my photographer, Craig White, to pan around here first because he can't hear what you're saying. So, Craig, go ahead and show a little panoramic view here. We're in an M88, which is a tank recovery vehicle, which you may see some of the soldiers who are here with us in the foreground. And then off in the background, you can see some of the lead elements of this force in Bradleys. Now, the Bradleys are the Bradley fighting vehicle, which is what the infantry soldiers, usually there are 8 or 9 infantrymen inside those Bradley vehicles. And then right in this tiny little group that we're in right here, there are not any tanks. You're mostly just looking at the Bradleys. And essentially, Lester, as to the minefields, we're clear through the minefield right now. We're into the southern Iraqi desert. It's not a section that's mined. What they did was they heavily mined. I mean, keep in mind, Iraq has some 10 million mines, and what they did was they mined right along the border so that they could try to stop the American forces from coming through. But as I say, under the cover of darkness, they had cleared those minefields.
We noted all those vehicles are so spread out. Is that just standard defensive doctrine we're seeing there?
Sure, absolutely. You don't want to provide a target to the enemy, so you make sure you stay well spread out so that if they hit one vehicle, it doesn't take them all out.
And Kerry Sanders, as your camera panned around, we apparently were seeing the same thing. Was your progress also slow? Were you dealing with the landmine issue as well?
Well, I can't reveal too much about our location, but I can say that the landmine issue has not presented itself yet, and I think that you can begin to sort of connect some of the dots by what that means. I also have a little information, and this is information that, quite frankly, is still being sorted out, but it appears that the Iraqi 11th Infantry Division may have actually moved some troops to the south, and that is maybe what is going to be presenting a little bit of a push for the U.S. military.
And David Bloom, I know each unit has its own objectives. What sense do these troops have of the big picture? For example, did they see any of the warplanes or the Tomahawks? Do they have any idea what's going on the big picture with regard to this war?
We were told at a briefing by the commanders of the 3rd Infantry Division that you would actually see the American Tomahawk cruise missiles flying overhead us as they made their way toward Baghdad. But we were actually moving out ahead of the main part of the force. We did not see any of that last night. Excuse me. Our troops were concentrated on their mission, which was to clear, as they say, those 2 Iraqi observation posts so that they could not relay word back to Baghdad as to what the location of this large force from the 3rd Infantry Division is. I mean, these soldiers, when they begin a mission like this, are very, very focused on what their specific task is. Do they know what the big picture is? Yeah. Do they know what some of their possible missions may be? Yes. They know those things. But their first mission was to get across that Iraqi line as quickly as they possibly could, with the artillery leading the charge as far as taking out those observation posts, then the infantrymen moving in to make sure that they were all clear. Again, their biggest concern was one of intelligence. They don't want the Iraqis to know where they are in southern Iraq so that they can make their approaches to Baghdad through routes of their own choosing, rather than having those Iraqi forces know exactly where they are.
Kerry Sanders, the fact that you guys are now on the Iraqi side, what has that done to the attitude, morale of the Marines you're with? Clearly, they've been anxious to go for a long time. We're losing, Kerry, we're losing your audio. We'll get it fixed and let folks know we are pushing the edges of technology here. You're seeing new technology being fielded here as we are literally with the troops here in uncharted territory as far as this war. Kerry, we're back now. Can you hear me okay?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you. Go ahead, pal.
Okay. I'm back. Go ahead, Lester.
All right.
The question?
Yeah, the question, I forgot the question already, but the morale, the issue of morale, the fact that these guys are finally on the move here after waiting in that desert for so long.
Well, you know, these guys have been gone from Camp Lejeune since January 9th, so they have been, quite frankly, they've gone through that military hurry up and wait, and they've gone to the good to go, and now they're at the level where, quite frankly, the lieutenant colonel here, Royal Mortensen, says he exactly wanted them at. They're right at the peak. They are really where they should be. It takes a lot, you know, to get these guys basically through that long period. They've been living in some miserable conditions in the desert for more than a month, and so they are now loaded up, but they have trained. You know, it's interesting. 65% of the U.S. Marine Corps is age 22 or younger. These are very young men who are here, and they've been psyching each other up. There was a decided change when they knew that the war had started, and since then they have been nothing but business, and quite frankly, some of them have been very honest when they said, I wouldn't be a human if I wasn't a little bit afraid of this, but I'm also well aware that I'm trained. They say that they believe that they work for the best military in the world, and they talk about something in the U.S. Marine Corps called muscle memory, that they have done so much training that when they get into that situation where they're actually engaging the enemy, they don't even have to think about it. Their muscle memory will take over. They will do exactly as they're trained, and they likely are going to be tested to that, perhaps very soon, Lester.
David, was there an anxiety level as you folks were making your way across the border, and is that now relaxed now that you apparently are through the minefield?
You know, Lester, I can't tell you that we've been through that minefield, and I can't say that we have gone through that. So let's not sort of go through that area yet.
Actually, I was referring to David's group. I'm sorry, Kerry. David, go ahead.
That's okay.
What I was saying, Lester, was that the anxiety level yesterday, to the extent that there was anxiety level, had to do with the possible chemical gas attack that the horn sounded, and we all had to sprint for. We had our gas masks on and had to put our chemical suits on, which of course we're still wearing. Kerry may have mentioned this, that they're going in what they call MOP 1, which means that we've got our chemical suits on, but we don't have gas masks on, we don't have our boots on, we don't have our gloves on. There was not so much an anxiety level with these forces as there was a sense of anticipation. Kerry mentioned that the Marines that he's with have been here since January. Elements of the 3rd Infantry Division have been here in Kuwait and now in Iraq longer than any other American forces since September and October of last year. So 6 months, going on 6 months, a lot of these forces have been here waiting to go. They firmly believe, and we've said this a lot over the last couple of days, that the only way for them to get home is through Baghdad. So now that the mission is underway and they've accomplished the first task of their mission, there is that sense of relief. They weren't too worried about this first part of the mission. It's the missions to come that they're more concerned about.
And David, we know that operational security is paramount, yet we are seeing this new relationship that both of you right now are showing us in its full glory. The fact that you have been taken, you're in the circle of trust, if you will, with the soldiers and Marines you are with. What is that relationship like? How has this test, this experiment gone so far in your view?
Well, let me answer that question as a journalist and answer it as just a person. I mean, as a journalist, obviously we're trying to maintain our objectivity and report factually what we see and hear here, and not to become one with the force, if you will, because we still have to maintain that appropriate journalistic distance. As a person, I can tell you that these soldiers have been amazing to us. They have done anything and everything that we could ask of them, and we in turn are trying to return the favor by doing anything and everything that they can ask of us. But as far as the relationship is concerned, we are about as one with this force as you could possibly be. We've been going out with these soldiers from the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division since December. We built relationships, we built trust, and I think that now they trust us and we trust them. Again, as a journalist, you have to maintain some distance. If there are problems that they encounter, we'll report those as well and let you know what's going on here, both the good things and the bad things. But just as a human being, they couldn't be any more generous, any more have embraced us into these units, because obviously our equipment, our presence can cause potential problems for them. It's cumbersome for them. There are 2 extra guys in this tank recovery vehicle that otherwise wouldn't be there. There are 2 more people they have to worry about feeding and clothing and all that. So that if you accept that they're willing to wrap us in their embrace, if you will, it's a relationship that so far has exceeded my greatest hopes.
It is an unprecedented kind of war coverage. David Bloom with the 3rd Infantry Division, Kerry Sanders with the Marines, General Schwarzkopf with us as well. David, we understand you have to move on. We'll let you go. Kerry, I'll get right back to you in a second, but I want to get General Schwarzkopf's view on this embedding of journalists. Do you think that this will, obviously it'll change the way we see wars. What do you think will be the overall impact when all is said and done?
Well, I think it's wonderful that we're having it this way. You know, it's a problem we've wrestled with for a very, very long time about how do you get reporting from the battlefield and yet at the same time make sure that you're not compromising things that would give the enemy an advantage. And so I'm tickled to death that it's going the way it's going. I think that this may be the solution. I would only disagree with one thing. You know, if you ever read the book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, this was Colonel Hal Moore and Joe Galloway, and Joe Galloway had a very, very close personal relationship with that unit and identified with the 1st Cav big time. So I think you don't necessarily have to maintain your objectivity totally as a journalist. I think you can use your heart a little bit with some of these guys you're dealing with.
I want to let Kerry Sanders weigh in with this. Kerry, tell me about your time with those Marines, and have you talked about some of those tough calls that may lie ahead when things get sticky?
Of course we have. I'm with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, and we've had those discussions because, quite frankly, nobody wants to have a surprise. Let me just give you a quick story here of just a conversation. You know, Marines are tough, and they don't want to project anything but how tough they really are. In an interview with one of the Marines here, the Marine actually got really teary-eyed talking about his family and took out a picture and just felt that what he was saying somehow, first of all, was not the image that he wanted to project, and second of all, the picture that he took out. Then he said, well, you know, if I actually became a enemy prisoner of war and somehow that tape got back, how that would affect him, you know, maybe I don't want that out there. So, you know, we sat and we had a little bit of discussion about that, and we came to what we felt was a compromise, that to show the tears in the eyes was to show the human side of who these people are, but not to show the picture of his daughter was perhaps something that made sense. We have often seen in previous wars, and General Schwarzkopf knows this, where people don't want even their last names used, just use their first names, especially the pilots, in the event that they get shot down. So I would say working with the Marines here has been sort of a give and take, but it comes down to sort of a reasonable aspect here. I mean, I don't think that we're compromising our journalism in the process of doing this. We've had the tough discussion of what happens if Marines get wounded or killed here on the battlefield, what we're going to do and how we're going to handle that. And as much as I can tell you that we think we have a approach that we're going to handle with that, you don't know the situation when it happens. Our plan were it to happen, and of course everybody hopes it doesn't, is to move away from the location where the injured, wounded, or dying are located, at least to a distance where we are not up so close to them that we're interfering with what they're doing, and second of all, where pictures would not in any way interfere with what they're trying to do, which is, God forbid, the Marine dies, that somebody at home is watching their loved one die. It's been a long practice at the network that when covering a war, you don't take the pictures, you don't notify basically the family of a loved one who has died in combat. So the way you do that,
Kerry
with pictures
Sanders,
is you back
that's
up.
part of the extraordinary conversation I was a privilege to be a part of earlier this evening. Two of our correspondents on the front lines with the troops, the ground war well underway. They are there to capture it all. I'm Lester Holt. Thanks for being with me throughout this evening. Our coverage of Target Iraq does not stop here. Forrest Sawyer is up next with continuing coverage here on MSNBC. I'll see you later on.
And a very good morning to you, everyone. I'm Forrest Sawyer. It is 1 a.m. on the East Coast. Here is the latest in Operation Iraqi Freedom. U.S.-led forces continue their ground assault from Kuwait into Iraq. As you recall, there were a series of artillery barrages, the 3rd Infantry Division punching a hole and moving on up into Iraq. British troops storming the Al-Faw Peninsula at the head of the Persian Gulf. That a key route for oil tanker traffic. And we hear that there are explosions heard near the southern Iraqi city of Basra, and troops have been racing very quickly there, facing no resistance. Now, U.S. intelligence does believe that Saddam Hussein, possibly both of his sons, this is very important stuff, were inside the Baghdad compound struck by American missiles on Wednesday night. Was the Iraqi leader injured? Perhaps he was even killed. What was that tape we saw? American officials believe that the videotape of Saddam that was broadcast after the strike may actually have been recorded prior to the attack, but the people we talked to are saying they are not at all sure at this point, and they want to be very, very careful. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld confirming just today the U.S. is in fact in touch with Iraqi forces. This includes some members of Saddam's elite Republican Guard, high-ranking members, we are told, and these are talks about surrendering. NBC News is hearing preliminary reports of wide-scale surrender by some other Iraqi forces, the 11th Division, which is down in the south. These are regular forces, the kind of forces that one would expect to surrender relatively quickly. They did the same thing back in 1991. Of course, we urge you to stay tuned for MSNBC. As all details come available, we will give them to you. We remind you, we do recap the latest headlines on the Iraqi crisis for you every 15 minutes. That's at the top of the hour, 15 minutes after, 30 and 45 here on MSNBC. So you can always tune in and get the latest. And for that matter, drop in on the web. We've got some good coverage there. We're very proud of it. It's iraq.msnbc.com. Complete coverage, as well as the Target Iraq Interactive Library. And that includes in-depth analysis, a slideshow, video, all this sort of stuff. You'll find it at iraq.msnbc.com. Of course, a lot of the work that is being done is coming right out of Doha, Qatar. That is where Central Command is based. With the remarkable technology that we have nowadays, they are able to understand and literally see in real time this very complicated battlefield in a way that they never have before. David Schuster is at CENTCOM right now with the latest. David, what's going on now?
Well, Forrest, to that end, the big word we've been hearing the last couple of days has been flexibility, and it becomes very curious when you combine the reports of intelligence believing that Saddam Hussein was in that bunker, when you combine that with the surrender talks involving the Iraqi Republican Guard, and the fact that by all accounts, the maneuvers of the Marines and the infantry that are heading into central Iraq was not according to the original war plans. It starts to make it all sort of very curious as perhaps whether or not maybe General Tommy Franks saw this sort of huge opportunity opportunity. Perhaps General Frank's not telling what the administration and the military commanders may suspect. But in any case, while they are appearing to sort of be winging it to some degree in central Iraq and southern Iraq, by all accounts, the war is going according to what military planners had suggested it would go over the last couple of weeks. And that is in Basra, which is a key southern town. It's a Shiite town that doesn't have a lot of love for Saddam Hussein, in part because of the brutal put down of the rebellion there 12 years ago at the end of the Persian Gulf War. The military and commanders here at CENTCOM still very interested in making a very big show at Basra of the liberation of Basra, Iraq's second largest city, in the hopes that the jubilation and the celebrations in the streets might break the back of Iraqi soldiers and the rest of the country. As that is going on, some sad news, of course, here at Central Command, the U.S. Central Command reporting and confirming the first American casualties in this war. 4 crew members on a CH-46 transport helicopter and 12 British Royal Marine Commandos who essentially were being transported back from Iraq over Kuwait. That chopper crashed at approximately 3 a.m. Baghdad time. This would have been in the middle of the night. Central Command says there's no indication whatsoever of any enemy fire or hostile fire. Every indication that weather perhaps was an issue. And when you look at the fact for us that the pilots of this particular chopper were using night vision technology, these particular helicopters have 2 rotors which tend to kick up a lot of dust and can make it very difficult sometimes to sort of figure out exactly where the ground is, and sometimes your judgment can be thrown off. Indication that perhaps that was a problem may have contributed to the crash. But in any case, 16 soldiers killed, 4 Americans, 12 British soldiers, the first fatalities of the war as we know it. But again, Central Command, still no briefings planned, and that, of course, is raising even more intrigue in the sense that we had expected that by this time they would be talking a little bit about the larger picture, but maybe because this sort of big picture is something that is new to them, or maybe they're changing plans very rapidly. Right now, the sort of official big picture as to what is going on, that is still under wraps. Forrest?
David Schuster in Doha, Qatar. Thank you very much, David. And as you can imagine, there is a lot of speculation that is going on right now about exactly what may be happening with those talks that we have heard about from so many different sources. Carl Rochelle is with the Pentagon right now. He has been there all through the night at his listening post, as we say. Carl, what are you hearing at this point?
Forrest, you're talking about the, I'm sorry, I had a telephone in my ear right before you came up. You're talking
we're
about...
glad to hear that, Carl. Work those sources. I was actually talking about the kinds of discussions that we have been hearing about, presumably with some pretty high members in the Republican Guard. I've heard them from a number of people, including some Congress people, some people that are on the Intelligence Committee, and they seem to be taking them very seriously. They say that there's some serious discussion that's taking place.
There have been, Forrest, and I would suggest to you, from what I have been told by senior government sources, that those communications were going on even before the first attack went down. The U.S. government, and I'm not sure exactly which branch of service was doing this, but the U.S. government was communicating with senior military leaders in Iraq not only by email, this is the modern era, not only by email, but also in direct telephone conversations with some members of the not the Republican Guard necessarily, but the military leadership in Iraq, trying to get them to lay down their arms, to keep their men in their barracks, to surrender, not to fight. And you may have seen some indication of this, Forrest, with what David Bloom ran into, because apparently most of the people in that 11th Army unit of the Iraqis that he ran into had given up to the U.S. forces. But yeah, I think I can confirm for you that those communications are going on. And let me suggest to you something else, too, that was told to me, that these discussions may be enhanced by the fact that no one really knows for sure whether Saddam Hussein is still alive. And as long as the Iraqi forces are more afraid of the U.S. military than they are of reprisals from Saddam Hussein, they may be more willing to talk, and that may be helping those talks along for us.
Well, Carl, I mean, you and I know that when we have a lack of real knowledge, we're thrilled to speculate. So let me throw a few more things into the hopper here to think about. Of course, we do know that there was medical treatment that was sent at that site where Saddam was saying. We do know that this was a massive attack. It was not only the bunker blaster bombs that came dropping in from those F-117s, but all of those cruise missiles that were launched from the Persian Gulf were literally pouring down on that one site. It's hard to imagine what that kind of force must have been like. And then from one source, an intelligence source, I've heard today that there is some belief that they may be in disarray in terms of command and control. All of this lends to the speculation that something really is up here.
I think you're absolutely right. You notice that the only appearances by Saddam Hussein, at least that we in this country have seen and that the public has seen, are those taped appearances. And a senior government source told me that they are still trying to determine when those appearances were taped. And that will be a key. We were told that they believe that Saddam, in the parlance that we use in the broadcast business, canned a few speeches, taped a few speeches in advance. Easy enough to figure out the date reference because they knew when the time would expire, because that is what President George Bush had set. They knew when the time would be out, so easy enough to insert a date reference. And particularly, it was pointed out that Saddam did not make any reference to strikes on Baghdad or other parts of Iraq, something one would have expected him to reference in any remarks that he made to the country, any remarks that he made calling on the Iraqi forces to draw their swords, if you will, and battle the U.S. and coalition forces coming in against them. So not sure yet whether he is still alive or dead. The sources say that they believe he likely is alive, but it's very likely that he may have been injured in that attack. The source is saying that emergency medical personnel were rolled into that bunker that was believed to be occupied by Saddam Hussein, members of his family, and senior military leaders in Iraq. And if that is true, if they were injured or killed, that would account for a lot of the disarray there, Forrest.
Well, heaven knows they've been trying to get him for an awful long time. Let me shift gears and ask you one last question. We're going to be moving up to George Lewis up in Turkey. And there has been a lot of concern on some parts that what Turkey is amassing along this border includes some significant amounts of armor. And some Turkish folks have actually told, in fact, Howard Feynman of Newsweek, that they are coming across. They are going to come across one way or the other, whether there's an agreement with the United States to do it or not. Now, this concerns the U.S. certainly, since, after all, the only thing that we'll be able to put in there is light infantry, the 82nd Airborne. They have to chopper them in from Kuwait because Turkey did not allow them to base out of there. So what are you hearing at the Pentagon about this issue?
Forrest, it has always been a concern what Turkey might do, might go across the border and go into those Kurds that are across on the other side. There are a lot of people who believe that the Turkish Kurds, the Kurds who live on the Turkish side of the border, don't want a free, independent, democratic Kurdish republic, if you will, up in that part of northern Iraq. So that was one of the reasons that the U.S. wanted this agreement with Turkey.
I don't understand that. Why wouldn't the Turkish Kurds want that?
It is a political issue because they would be operating differently from the Kurds who were in the Turkish. One set would be under the Turkish government, the other set would be free to establish their own Kurdish republic, if you will. And there would be some dichotomy between the two sides of it.
Wouldn't that be a problem for Turkey because they would be afraid of the establishment of a free Kurdistan that would include part of their country?
Exactly, and that's why there was concern about Turkey putting forces across the border into Iraq in that Kurdish area. They wanted U.S. forces to be in that area. Part of the agreement was to control how far Turkey could put forces in. You know, there's a big problem after Desert Storm because a lot of Kurdish refugees crossed over into Turkey and created havoc over there, totally out of control. And, you know, there was a mess in there for years after the end of the Desert Storm operation. It's a big concern right in that area. Forrest, you're absolutely right.
Great. Carl Rochelle at the Pentagon. Always good to talk to you, Carl. Thanks a lot. One fellow who knows about this stuff is George Lewis. He is actually in Turkey. And George, forgive me, I don't know precisely where you are. Perhaps you can tell me. You heard the conversation we were just having. What's your take on all this?
Well, it's a potential mess, Forrest. I'm in the city of Diyarbakir in eastern Turkey, and from this point eastward, this is pretty much Kurd country in Turkey. Now, to give you a little historical perspective, for 15 years, the Turks battled the Kurds on their own territory in a rather nasty rebellion that took about 35,000 lives. What many Kurds want is their own independent state of Kurdistan, and that would include territory in what is now northern Iraq and in what is now Turkey. The Turks don't want that. that. That's why they're massing that huge force on the border. They've been inside Iraq, patrolling a buffer zone. What the Pentagon fears and what Washington fears is that they'll go deeper with their heavy armor, and that there may be a turf war over the oil fields in northern Iraq. Washington has been very adamant that Turkey should not go any deeper into northern Iraq. But what happened yesterday is the parliament approved sending its army deeper into Iraq, as it approved overflight rights for the U.S. So what Turkey is saying is, yeah, you can pursue the war using our airspace. Don't put your soldiers here, though. There are no ground rights for U.S. soldiers, and that is a potential problem, as you and Carl Rochelle were discussing. What the U.S. would like to do is put a sufficient force in northern Iraq to be able to control the situation, to make sure that Saddam's army is taken care of and that the Turks and the Kurds don't clash. What they don't want is this war within a war with the Turks and the Kurds, two U.S. allies, battling each other. So, well, yeah, it is shaping up as a potentially messy situation.
Here's how this plays out, and it goes a couple of different ways. I think you've really put your hands on it. The problem with the Kurds is one thing. But if they take some of that armor and decide to go merrily on down to Mosul and Kirkuk, where the oil fields are, the United States hasn't got a thing in the world that they can do militarily to stop them, and they won't try, because it's a terrible political mess. So now you got a fait accompli. You got the Turks who are controlling these oil fields, and I presume the only thing that will prevent them from doing that is the political consequence of not being allowed in the UN, and the NATO consequences, and perhaps losing some U.S. aid. But I have to believe those oil fields look mighty pretty to them.
Oh yeah, the oil fields are a very tempting target for all concerned. The Kurds want them, the Turks want them. What the U.S. wants to do is try to establish this new independent Iraq and try to get everybody working together within that framework. That's going to be the tricky part. It's always been that winning the war, defeating Saddam's army, might be the easy part. Managing the consequences of winning that war may be the hard part. And what the U.S. doesn't want is having to fend off a NATO ally, Turkey, that's been our ally for 50 years. They want the Turks to cool it, and they're hoping that in Ankara, in the Turkish capital, cooler heads will prevail.
Well, we're just going to have to see. Let us hope that's how it turns out. George Lewis in Turkey, thank you for your good work and your good talk, George. I appreciate it. We are following, of course, this crash. This is the first casualties in this war, and as so often happens, they are accidental. Imagine how many helicopters have been going up in the air to be able to move these folks. The 101st moves by helicopter, the 82nd Airborne moves by helicopter, the Marines come choppering in, and as it happens, it was a Marine helicopter, something like a Chinook, a little bit smaller, as a matter of fact. It's called a Sea Knight, double-rotored helicopter. Been around for a long time. It's an old warhorse, been there for decades, as a matter of fact, a good, solid performer for the Marines. But if you've got this many machines in the air and you have got the kinds of sandstorms that we have seen, you know you're going to have some problems coming along the way. It appears that it may, and I underscore may, have been weather-related that brought down this Sea Knight and 12 British commandos, 4 Marines. Dr. Bob Arnott, who covers foreign affairs for MSNBC, is right there and with us to talk about it. Bob, am I correct? You were in or around this mission?
Yes, Forrest. I wanted to say at the top here, we're not clear to talk about the entire mission. It was a major, very bold, very dramatic mission to set in a blocking force. We started out here yesterday afternoon, as you know, air raid after air raid. We were in full mop suits and gas masks, running out to the flight line there. A lot of brave Marines putting their lives on the line just to get us launched. We launched from there up to what's called a PZ, which is a pickup zone. And it was an amazing sight. It's in the desert. If you've seen the movie Three Kings, it looked just like that, flat, no real detail. Moon shining through a very sort of thick haze. Dozens and dozens of CH-46s, the Frog that we were on, 53s, which are the much bigger helos carrying 35 combat-ready troops, and at the leading edge, the Cobras. When our group then launched in the middle of the night, it was the Cobras that went out first with tremendous suppressive fire into this area. This is an area where There's been a lot of fighting, a lot of casualties, where the Iraqis are fighting back extremely hard. Firing back, if you can believe it, at AC-130 gunships. To have one of those circling around you and be firing back at it. Our mission launched. After launch, the visibility went from 2 or 3 miles down to between 1/4 and 1/2 of a mile. And as you know, if you are a pilot, that is called low instrument conditions. Those conditions, a commercial airliner, unless it was a Cat 2 or Cat 3, would not be landing at. We're all flying at about 100 feet. There are power lines out there. It's indistinguishable terrain. We had our night vision goggles on, and with sand kicked up the way it was in that low visibility, you can't see anything. You're literally blinded. The Marines own the night. They own it because of these night vision goggles. It gives them a tremendous advantage, but at that point in time, it was just a complete sort of blind out. Now, the accompanying helicopter saw it pitched nose down, and they said, pull up, pull up, pull up. And great tragedy is that these men, whom we knew in our camp here, they were our sort of sister squadron from the 268, lost their lives. There were 4 of them, and there was a tremendous fireball as it hit the ground. We had British Marine commandos with us as well, and you can just imagine how sad people were. One of our crew chiefs on our plane, a man named Ewell, knew the pilot, knew him well, had trained with him. At this point in time, as you pointed out correctly, it's speculation as to what it was. No question that the weather was just appalling. Like the JFK Jr. crash, you may recall the weather then had been reported as good, and yet he got caught in a real trap. Same thing last night. I talked with many of the weather briefers. We expected 72 hours of very good weather. When we took off, when we launched, I could probably see 2 or 3 miles on the ground, and yet it quite quickly went just terribly bad. A couple of theories here. One is that there may have been some loss of power at the front rotor. Another is that it may have hit a power line, although there were no power lines around. The last is that there was just some kind of spatial disorientation, although these were very, very good pilots. Of course, we were out recently training with them in the night exercises. They all recently got their night calls to make certain that they were up, they were ready to go.
Bob, let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you for a question, because I'm intrigued by how you described what happened with the Sea Knight when it went down. I was with some Apache drivers in Tirana during some of the Kosovo fighting, and they would be going up into the mountains there where the air was rather rarefied, and they were pretty loaded. And because they were loaded, it caused them to be in greater distress. And they had 2 events where they crashed, on both cases, because they just couldn't maintain control in the weather. And it sounds like what you're describing is the helo kind of pitching over, and that could also have something to do with the load, I'm guessing, if they were carrying a total of 16, yeah?
Well, it's a pretty good load. They haven't made clear exactly how many British commandos were on board. We've heard 5, we've heard 8, we've heard 12. We are going to get guidance on that exact number.
Bob, forgive me. I'm going to have to jump in. I appreciate your point. I thank you for talking with us. In Kuwait City, I believe we're hearing some sirens coming in, and Don Teague is there. And Don, I gather from your appearance that you got some missiles coming in. All right, Bob is not able to talk to.
It's not something I'm enjoying, I'll tell you that. We feel pretty well protected here. We've got the masks, which are the basic defense, but we have other defense with us as well. Flak jackets, helmets, things like that. If incoming rounds were to come here, we don't expect that artillery can reach this city. But, a missile shot that gets through could definitely cause damage. So, it's not something I want my wife and kids necessarily watching, but there you go.
Let me interrupt you. Don Teague is talking to our sister network, CNBC. And what you're seeing is the concern that they have missiles that are coming in. This is not unlike what happened in 1991. In fact, it is precisely the same thing that we saw in 1991 when Saddam would throw Scuds, which
heads are just sort of on a swivel.
Let's listen and see if we can hear this.
We could do about any impact if it were right here on top of us. But if we actually hear or see anything coming down in the city, you'll see us run pretty quickly for shelter. Thank you.
was Don Teague there. He was talking to our sister network, CNBC. We're going to go back there very shortly. I was saying that this is not unlike what happened in 1991 when, at about this stage, the Iraqis began throwing Scud missiles at Dhahran and at Riyadh, where U.S. forces were based. For the most part, you were pretty safe if he was throwing them at you because they had no sort of accuracy whatsoever. And never once was a chemical weapon attached. Obviously, people are very concerned about it, but so far of the missiles that have come in, there have been no chemical weapons used at all. And although precautions are necessary, alarm is something that is probably not needed at this point. Don Teague is joining us now. How are you faring there, Don?
We're doing okay. We obviously went back to the gas masks here just about 5 minutes ago because we had a citywide alarm, the air raid sirens, that by my count, I think it's about the 8th time we've gone through this since noon yesterday, Kuwait time. You know, we take these seriously because, as we have found out now, these sirens do, in some cases, signify actual missile launches. Fortunately for the residents here in Kuwait, they've been intercepted by Patriot missiles in times past, but we haven't been given the all clear here yet. So, you know, we're going to do the thing and stay masked up here and just keep our eyes open and wait for that.
I understand. It was my understanding that the Patriots have not been terribly accurate. In 1991, they were not accurate much at all. I think there's been one that's knocked it down. Have they gotten better?
Well, you know, the Patriots here, they tell us, are the Patriot 3 missiles, which are an improved Patriot, and they work in a different way. There's software on board that allows them to actually triangulate, if you will, and meet an incoming missile in the air is much better. They also actually target that missile differently. The original Patriot was a proximity explosion. It gets somewhere in the area and it explodes, and you hope that the basically fragmentation takes out the missile. The Patriot they have here now, and the ones that we've seen scattered all around this country, is designed to be a direct hit. It sort of hits like a bullet, taking out that other missile that's incoming, and it's supposed to reach them much further out. So, you know, what we've seen, the military has confirmed a total of 3 incoming missiles over the last couple of days, and they say they shot down at least 2 of them and haven't determined how the other one came down, but the good news is no one has been impacted by those incoming missiles yet.
All right, Don Teague in Kuwait City. Do stay safe there, Don. And one can take heart in the knowledge that it's very difficult to disperse chemical weapons. They tend to land and not go very far, so this is not a simple technology. Unless you're able to explode it in the air over an area, it doesn't disperse very far. And there are a lot of people who don't think that Saddam Hussein, at least at this stage in fighting, would be willing to use chemical weapons because it would turn world opinion against him so strongly. Let us move from Kuwait City to what some refer to as the pointy end of the spear. It is the 3rd Infantry Division that drove out of Kuwait City and punched that hole out there using artillery fire to allow U.S. and British forces to move out, heading toward Baghdad and then also moving off in the direction of Basra, and they've been moving there very quickly. Our own David Bloom is right out there with them, and this is just how remarkable our own technology is as it catches up with the technology of the military. These are live pictures of as far forward a force as there is, I do believe, David. I mean, you're about right there on the edge, aren't you?
We are, Forrest. We're with the 315 Infantry of the 2nd Brigade of the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, and these soldiers were literally the first ones to cross over into Iraq last night. The attack began with artillery around 8 p.m. our time. It's now coming up on about 9:30 in the morning here, so it's 13 and a half hours ago. Behind me are some of the soldiers who are in this infantry division. Guys, come over for just a sec. And these guys were among the first to actually head out into Iraq. Their mission, the artillery was hitting 2 observation posts. The idea was to knock out those observation posts because they didn't want the Iraqis to be able to get word back to Baghdad as to where the routes were that the U.S. forces were coming through. Tell me your name and where you're from.
Specialist Schultz, Lucas, from La Crosse, Wisconsin.
Okay. And tell me about this mission.
It went pretty smoothly, I think. I think we did a pretty good job.
Now, you guys are infantry, and what you did was you sort of made a beeline for these observation posts, right? I mean, you set up kind of a blocking force so that other forces could then move in?
Roger. We cleared the way.
Okay. And tell me your name and where you're from?
David Dreyer from Cleveland, Ohio.
Okay, David. And tell me about the mission that you guys undertook last night.
Well, we just followed the artillery, and there's pretty much nothing left, and we just set up and let everybody pass through.
When you say there was nothing left, what David's saying is that there were these two large observation posts containing anywhere between 10 and 30 Iraqi soldiers apiece. And as I say, the mission of this lead element of the 3rd Infantry Division was, frankly, to wipe those soldiers out because they didn't want anyone making a phone call or anything like that back to Baghdad to say, hey, this is the route they're coming through, because obviously the routes are critical in terms of how they'll go up to Baghdad. Let me talk to one more soldier here. Tell me your name and where you're from.
Sergeant Kevin Blackman from Columbia, South Carolina.
Okay. And tell me about you're in this Humvee, right, with the machine gun on top, is that right?
Yeah, with the 3rd Military Police Company out of Fort Stewart. We're attached to the Bravo Company 315.
So tell me what your mission was last night and now today.
Just pretty much just go along with them and any possible enemy surrenderies, anything like that. We just kind of take control of them and take care of them.
But as I understand it, there wasn't anyone left to surrender, is that right?
To my knowledge, no.
Right. I want to introduce you to one more person here who's making the rounds here this morning. This is the chaplain for the 315, Steve Hommel, and he just happened to be walking by here talking to these soldiers. Tell me what you're doing in this situation now, chaplain.
Well, the main thing is just, going around, talking to the soldiers. We're all kind of experiencing it together and, getting through it.
You've got a unique perspective on this because you were in the 101st Airborne in the First Persian Gulf War, left to go to seminary school, then decided to come back into active duty. So you can not only talk to these men about their faith, but you can also talk to them about what it's like to be in combat.
Yeah, that's a big thing. The first time that I went in, I was an infantry sergeant. And, having gone through it once and coming back again, I don't have... those fears of the unknown. I mean, what do you really know about warfare if you haven't been there? Just the movies and in your imagination. So one of the things I do is I tell the guys, it's not going to be as bad as you think it's going to be. Now, it's not going to be good, but it's not going to be as bad as your imagination can make it. And, trying to talk to them about just living one day at a time.
Okay.
And I think that's pretty much the consensus of all of us here who are combat veterans, talking to the guys who haven't been here before.
Chaplain Steve Hommel and the other guys, thank you all so very much. We appreciate it. So the spirits are pretty high here right now. As I say, they've encountered only light opposition thus far. There are 3 Iraqi army divisions here in southern Iraq. We're getting reports on the military radios that at least one of those Iraqi armor divisions has capitulated, signed the capitulation documents, surrendered, which, if accurate, and we have no reason to believe that it's not, clearly is what the U.S. military hoped for. That is that those regular army forces from Iraq would not be the ones to fight, that they would by and large be willing to give up, go back to their garrisons, put their vehicles in a circle to let them know that they're friendly, fly the white flag rather than the Iraqi flag. So for all those reasons, these guys, once the main elements of this force get in, remember the 3rd Infantry Division is 20,000 soldiers, 250 tanks, hundreds of Bradley infantry vehicles. Once those get in here, then this force will pick their routes and start heading north toward Baghdad, where they're likely to face more stiff opposition from the Republican Guard and the Special Republican Guard, which are right now in these belts encircling Baghdad. Forrest?
David, I'm intrigued by this report that you have that there are some surrenders. I believe, based on something that I had read that you had reported.
Forrest, I'm sorry if you're talking to me right now, but I've lost this sat phone IFB. I'm going to try to redial it, but I'll get back to you in a minute here.
All right. There goes David Bloom. This is what happens. We do love our technology, but sometimes it doesn't work as well as we would like. Let us check back in with Don Teague, who has been enduring the occasional siren. It's just part of life during war in a city like Kuwait City. Don, how's that gas mask? You got it off yet? There, Don Teague. I recognize you now.
Yes.
What you're hearing there is the all clear siren. I would say we had the 9th air raid alarm that we've had since about noon yesterday, 8th or 9th. It's hard to keep track. And you know, we are following our SOP with NBC News, which is until we hear those all clears, or until our experts that we employ to come here with us and help us in a zone like this tell us to unmask. We put the masks on and we leave them on. So.
You should.
We've been going through.
And well, you should, Don. Although there are certain nerve agents which, if they touch your skin, kill you instantly. So there's that to think about.
Well, and we certainly know about that. We are undercover here. It's hard to tell from the way this shot is, but we do have a protective covering over us in this area. And if there were any impact, we have complete chemical suits that are here with us under this cover that we can put on and either stay here, or I'm about 20 feet from a hardened concrete shelter that I can then run into. So we're certainly aware of all of the intricacies of biological and chemical weapons that you could possibly face in a situation like this.
How are the good people of Kuwait City handling this new turn of events in their lives?
You know, it's really interesting. When I've been here for a little over 2 months, and when we arrived here, there was all of this talk about giving everyone in the city, the 2 million people in this country, gas masks issued by the government. I've seen one, and I don't know of anyone other than the one person who came to show everyone that he had a gas mask. Everyone else, as we watch, first of all, I should tell you, it's very quiet on the streets in general. Not a lot of people out and about for obvious reasons, but during this last air raid siren, behind the camera, if you will, in front of me, I can see about a quarter of a mile away a cricket game underway in a dirt field, and they never slowed down. They sort of have this feeling that the U.S. troops and the Patriot missiles are going to protect this city no matter what, and some people are just going to go on about their lives, just never mind what risk there may be.
Well, the good news is we're going to go back to David Bloom and get some further confirmation about this, but there are a lot of surrenders that are going on of those Iraqi regular forces that are off to your north there, so perhaps you won't have to endure this too much longer. Don Teague, thanks for talking to us, Don. Hopefully, one hopes that David Bloom has been able to dial the sat phone and has us back. And David, are you there?
I hear you, Forrest. Yep, go ahead.
Okay, great. The question I was asking was about the reports of surrenders that you had heard. I had read the basis of another of your reports, which said it was the 11th Armored Division, and I had also read that the 12th had been negotiating surrenders. So I'd like to ask you whether you have heard that, and if true, those two together would constitute about 2/3 of the force there in the south.
Right. I got to put this the right way for us, because obviously there are things that we know that we can't report. But suffice it to say that there were entreaties to these forces even before the air war or the ground war began. And there were cues and indications from the commanders of some of these forces that they would be more than willing to sign the capitulation document once the armed forces of the United States started to roll into Iraq and once the hostilities commenced. I can't independently confirm to you the report about the 12th. I know that the report about the 11th, I have absolutely no reason to doubt that it's true. But again, this is not inconsistent with what these forces thought that they would expect to face here in southern Iraq, in that, remember, the regular army divisions of Iraq are conscripted, if I could say that word, B, very poorly maintained in terms of training, in terms of the money that they're given, et cetera, et cetera. So there was an expectation, if you will, on the part of the American forces, certainly a hope on the part of the American forces, that they would be more likely to surrender. Now, having said that, it's the Republican Guard, and you don't want to belabor this or beat the drumbeats too loudly, but the Republican Guard is encircled around Baghdad, and they have large numbers of tanks, heavy artillery, a much more formidable force for the Americans to face. They still think that for example, the range on their tanks is far better for the Americans. They're not if you would say, worried about these forces, but they're much more formidable opposition. And of course, the Special Republican Guard is the one that's actually inside Baghdad, much tighter quarters. So to say that these regular army forces, or at least some of them, are capitulating, are surrendering, are choosing not to fight is A, not a surprise, and B, doesn't take away the much more daunting mission that these soldiers might face in the next couple days.
Well, indeed, and here's the problem about all of this, David. You recall back in 1991, the forces were literally surrendering just as fast as they could find the Americans. I even had some surrender to me because they were just looking for anybody who looked Western. If you get this many people who are surrendering, that in itself is a problem, which is why the U.S. has been saying perhaps their commanders could keep their sidearms and they could just march those guys back to the barracks and have a seat till this is all over. So how are they handling it?
You're exactly right there, Forrest. In fact, if I was back inside the M88 that we're traveling in, I would show you the capitulation form, both in Arabic and in English, which the commanders have to sign. And one of the things is that those commanders become responsible for those forces. Yes, there's a small U.S. armored force that guards them, that watches over them. What they tell them to do is to put their vehicles, I'm just going to use my foot here, they put their vehicles in a square, point their gun turrets in, march their soldiers back into the barracks, and what they're told is, look, as long as you guys don't do anything, we're not going to fight you. If you make any sort of offensive maneuver whatsoever, we're going to unleash the Apaches, we're going to unleash the F-16s, we're going to unleash the artillery, we're going to unleash the tanks. So once you sign this document, you've capitulated. Now, I'll tell you another thing about what you alluded to in terms of the surrenders. What they've done is, A, they've beefed up the military police. They've also set up enemy prisoner of war camps inside of Iraq. They've established those so that they can flow those enemy prisoners of war into those camps much more methodically, much more organized fashion than they did in the first Gulf War. And in addition to that, some of the most heavily armored of the American forces are going to try to avoid those garrisons, etc., and move through other routes so that they don't have to get confronted with having to deal with those prisoners of war.
It's really interesting, and it's an indication of the, I don't mean to be rude, but the disdain that the United States has for these regular forces, because they're going to leave them essentially to their rear and drive on and not particularly worry about them, which under ordinary circumstances might not be the best policy.
That's right. I mean, obviously, with, for example, 20,000 soldiers in the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, they feel like they can leave enough of a force behind so that they can safeguard themselves. And remember, what they're going to do is they're going to have the soldiers in one place and their weapons in another place, perhaps a couple miles away, so that any move that they would make from one garrison to where their weapons and their vehicles are stored would be evident to the American soldiers there. But you're right. Having said that, what they want to do is not get distracted by those regular Army forces. They want to just keep plowing on toward Baghdad, confront what they see as the crown jewel of the Iraqi military, such as it is, wipe that out, and if they do that, they believe that they'll accomplish their mission, which is the collapse of this regime.
Yeah, my guess is they could leave 5 guys there to guard 200,000, and they'd probably be just fine. The ones that I talked to, I remember I talked to one who had surrendered, and he actually was a medical student in Chicago. And he had flown back to Iraq and got caught and was conscripted and sent up to the front to go live underneath the rain of rolling thunder from the B-52. So he was so thrilled to see the Americans, he was practically dancing. And I think there's going to be a lot of that.
Well, First of all, I'm glad that you can say conscripted better than I can. Second of all, Forrest, what I would tell you is that, just to add to that story, some of these Iraqi soldiers were trying to surrender to the American forces even before the war began. They went up to the Kuwaiti checkpoints, were told, look, we're not going to let you come into Kuwait. Once the hostilities begin, you can surrender, not before. So clearly there are some forces that are eager to surrender, but I mean, not to belabor this point, but I don't think we want to make too much of this. There are still vital missions that, for example, the 3rd Infantry Division has to undertake. There are still, major targets of opportunity and more formidable forces that they could face. So while the first few hours of this ground war are going perhaps as best as could be expected, we don't know what lies ahead.
Oh, you have to agree about that. I mean, the question never was what was going to happen there in the desert in the south. We knew that the regular army was going to roll over. Ultimately, it is going to come to that point where you have to invest Baghdad, and assuming that there are no surrender talks, and one hopes that there will be, that's what it's really going to come down to. It's going to come down to what those Special Republican Guard forces do, whether they fight to the end or they don't.
And what they're hoping to do, Forrest, is to wipe out, in as much as they can, the major weaponry of the Iraqis, so that their ability to defend even Baghdad would be highly constrained. That's why these forces are moving as fast as they are. That's why they're moving into Iraq on such short notice, picking up the pace of the ground war, if you will, because of the two events, both the target of opportunity in terms of the Americans striking the military leadership targets, perhaps even Saddam Hussein, and then, of course, the Iraqi response with the Scud or El Samud missiles. That picked up the pace of the ground war, but they're clearly right now where they want to be, and the issue is how fast do they get up toward Baghdad and confront those other more formidable forces.
I have some friends who are in the 101st Airborne, and as you know, they are some guys who are trained to literally do that house-to-house fighting, which is going to be necessary in urban warfare. And as you know also, David, the technological advantage that the United States enjoys when you're in a clear playing field, as you are now, is lost once you're up inside an urban area. Have you talked to some of the men there about that circumstance and how they feel about the possible battles that may come?
We have, Forrest, and let me say a couple things about that. First of all, you're absolutely right. I mean, keep in mind, this is the only tank battalion in the Persian Gulf region for the United States. I mean, this is what they call the Iron Fist. But tanks don't work nearly as well in urban environments as they do out here in the open desert. This is ideal, perfect tank country. Once they move into the major cities, once they would be forced to move into Baghdad, they would confront a much more difficult situation. Now, having said that, what they've been doing out here for the last couple months, and we've been coming back and forth from the States out to Kuwait to watch them, is they've been doing what they call the MOUT training, which is the urban warfare training. They set up little mini cities. They went through and they attacked them. They used the tanks to block, and they used the Bradleys to come in. So they've been practicing this warfare. There are other troops that can do this well as well. So they're prepared for that contingency. Clearly, that's not what these forces want. I mean, if you ask them, do you want to be fighting from building to building in Baghdad, the answer is no. But they don't expect that that's going to be the case anyway. I mean, what they would far hope happens is that they can hit strategic targets in Baghdad and, again, cause the collapse of the regime. They stress over and over again they don't want some fight with the Iraqi people. They don't even want to fight with the Iraqi army. They don't even want to fight with the Republican Guard or the Special Republican Guard if they'll lay down their arms. But the way that they hope to avoid that is to hit those strategic targets in Baghdad, cause the collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime, and rob them of the will to fight. That's the one thing that you hear again and again from these forces, is so that they don't have to have some either A, siege of Baghdad, or B, onslaught of Baghdad, both of which the U.S. almost certainly would win, but maybe at a higher casualty rate than certainly the Americans or the Iraqis would want to see.
Well, a couple of things. One intelligence source has said this evening, David, that there is at least a suspicion that the Iraqi leadership has lost control of the command and control, which would at least help explain some of the paralysis. Additionally, I've got former Marine Major Jack Stradley, who's a military analyst here and who knows more than both of us put together and a lot more than that about military tactics. So, Jack, let me ask your opinion of what we've been jawboning about. What do you see as the problems that lie ahead?
Well, obviously things have gone very well to this point, and that would concern me or any commander out there. If things are going too smoothly, you're waiting for the hammer to fall. So far things seem to be going well, but the fight lies ahead, as you've already pointed out, around Baghdad as they get closer to the Republican Guard, the Special Republican Guard. What's
the job of the 3rd Infantry here at this point? They're clearly not going to be moving into the city, but they are going to be critical to investing it.
Correct. I think, speculation on my part, but I imagine their mission is to move up close to Baghdad, set up strong points around the city, maybe engage the Republican Guard out of the city if they'll come out and fight, and set up those support areas so that probably limited objective raids can then be conducted in Baghdad if that becomes necessary, and support those kinds of operations, the infantrymen on the ground there.
David, I could be wrong about this. Perhaps my memory fails as I totter into my old age. But I believe it was the third that did that remarkable Hail Mary back in 1991 that Norm Schwarzkopf called for, is just this incredible fast run all the way around the Iraqi forces. Am I right? David, did you hear the question that I asked you?
No, I'm sorry, Forrest. I didn't hear you. I was talking to one of your producers. Tell me again what you're saying.
Forgive me. I said I could be wrong about this, but as I recall, it was the 3rd Infantry that did that remarkable Hail Mary maneuver back in 1991, which was an incredibly fast, literally just a run, so that their logistical tail had all manner of problems. It was it not?
It was. I mean, they went by a different name then. It was the 24th Infantry Division, but it's the same group. That was commanded by General Barry McCaffrey. This is commanded by General Buff Blunt, but it's the same, it's the same elements. In fact, the 3 task force commanders that we're out with here are all Persian Gulf veterans from that renamed 24th, now part of the 3rd Infantry Division. And what they made was what you'd call the big left hook to sweep around the Iraqi forces and surprise them. And these forces are clearly capable of doing that. That's why they're here, basically, is because they can be such a fast-moving force. I mean, the tanks for us can drive at up to 55 to 60 miles an hour across the desert. They're not going to go that fast. They'd outrun their supply lines. But clearly the tanks and the Bradleys can race ahead, and they clearly are much faster than the other trailing vehicles, the Humvees, the fueling trucks, the medics, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, a couple of interesting things. In this case, they don't have to worry about the logistical problems so much. They can just let the tail keep up with them as they're moving along. That's not a problem. And I mean, it's fair to say they don't really have a problem with any Iraqi tanks either. They can stand off and drop anything that's anywhere near. I think they've got a range of about, what, 2 miles?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's the tremendous advantage that the U.S. has. I mean, the most sophisticated Iraqi tank is the T-72, and frankly, I mean, it could pose some danger, but it does not stack up to the M1A1, the Abrams tank that the Americans are using. And basically, that's a function of old NATO versus Soviet doctrine. The NATO strategy was to engage the Soviet forces from longer ranges. The Iraqis have the Soviet tanks. The Americans obviously have their tanks. They're much longer range. They're much more powerful. They're much more heavily armored, which is why they believe that they can take on these heavily armored Iraqi divisions and succeed if indeed it comes to that.
Yeah, you're talking about, when you say a T-72, you're talking about an old Soviet tank, and I'm assuming that they probably have problems even getting parts for them at this point. But it raises a fair question, which is, and I'm always curious to ask this of commanders, what is it, given all the things that we've been talking about, that keeps them awake at night? Where do they see the problems?
And are you still talking to me, Forrest? I'm sorry.
I was, David. I was asking, if you've asked that question, what is it that keeps commanders awake at night? What problems do they actually worry about?
Well, one of the things is certainly the possibility of a chemical, gas, or biological attack. I mean, clearly that's been a concern to these forces. That's why we're in what they call MOP 1 with the chem suits on, not the gas masks, not the boots, not the gloves, but certainly the chemical suits. And obviously I got my gas mask right here. So that's a concern. Although you alluded to this before, when you were talking about Kuwait City, a force like this that's moving along, and we're stopped right now because the other elements of the force are catching up with this. But I mean, by and large, this force will be rolling along, and a force that's moving along is very hard to hit with artillery strikes. I mean, clearly, especially given, as you said, the inaccuracy of the Iraqi missiles. Their artillery is a little bit more accurate, but a force that's rumbling along, very difficult, especially with these desert winds in terms of that. I mean, obviously, one of the other things they worry about is their supply train in terms of the fuel. These Abrams and these Bradleys consume a lot of fuel. I think that it's about 7.5 miles to the gallon or something like that. I mean, they burn a lot of fuel as they're rumbling through the desert. So you got to keep your fuel trucks up. What they've got is they've got the smaller 2,500 gallon fuelers, which can keep up with the Abrams and the Bradleys. And then they've got the 5,000 gallon tanks, which come up beside those, refuel the 2,500s, and then the 2,500s go and catch up with the Abrams and the Bradleys. So those are two of their concerns. And then obviously the fact of the matter is, there are, as I keep saying, large Iraqi tank divisions to the south of Baghdad, which some force is going to have to confront. And so the question is, is this force one of those that confronts those, and are they up to that challenge? They're clearly not concerned about their training. They're not concerned about their equipment. They're not concerned about their morale. They're not concerned about the ability of the U.S. forces. They've got not only these formidable ground forces, but they also have air support from the A-10, the Thunderbolts, better known as the Warthogs, which can loiter over the skies and do with their Gatling guns and missiles very close air support, knocking out those Iraqi tanks. They've got the Apache attack helicopters, which can also fire the Sidewinder missiles. They've got F-15s in terms of air-to-air battles, which are not likely to come because the Americans, frankly, control the skies, at least as far as we can see, but also the F-16s, which can do the air-to-surface attacks. So it is a very daunting task. I don't know if you were listening to us earlier. We were talking to Sergeant Major Bob Gallagher, who's one of the real stars of this 3rd Infantry Division. He's a former Ranger, and you'll recall in Black Hawk Down, he was one of the ones who led the elite Rangers in to rescue those downed helicopters. And he said to us, good thing the Iraqis are surrendering. They didn't have any choice. Now, clearly, that's not going to be the case all along. And as the military commentator who you were talking to, voiced the concern, you don't want these forces to become too upbeat, too complacent. They're not. They're just positioned right now, ready for their next task as the rest of this force rolls in.
I just want to tell you, you mentioned the Warthog, which is one of the ugliest planes ever built.
I don't know if you can hear me, but I lost you once again here, so I'm going to redial.
All right, well, we've lost David. We're about to lose the hour here, so we will pause. But thank you. That is, of course, David Bloom, who is really in a remarkable position. Jack Stradley sitting here beside me to be able to see this war as it is prosecuted. And I was saying that the Warthog is an incredibly ugly plane, and it is much maligned. But I fell in love with this plane in 1991 when I was standing across with some Special Forces guys from an artillery battery. And they still use the old tactic of trying to walk toward you, which is they fire at you and it misses, and then they sort of re-ratchet, and then they try to walk toward you. And we're standing there eating some fruit salad, waiting to see if they were going to hit us. And they had called in a Warthog, which comes drifting in like the ugliest butterfly you've ever seen, throws off a little chaff, comes back around, smashes the artillery battery in 2 seconds, and then drifts on home again. And at that point, I fell in love.
Well, a lot of people are in love with that airplane. It's literally a flying tank. It's heavily armored. It carries a lot of munitions, and it's designed for this kind of warfare. Like you said, it can take a lot of incoming fire and still give better than it takes.
Jack, are you surprised by how this war is faring at this point? I mean, we were all sort of poised and on our toes, waiting for shock and awe. And it comes in on little cat feet.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think that maybe the target of opportunity, going for the leadership, that opportunity that presented itself on the first night, the administration took that chance, fired some Tomahawks in there, dropped some bunker busters in there, and then decided we've got nothing to lose by kind of waiting or going slow and see what the effect was. And if, in fact, we did decapitate the regime and they capitulate in the next few days, then we were very fortunate.
It's clearly what they're doing, and what a surprise it was. David, I hear you are back with us, and we have time for just one last question, which is about your welfare. I'm curious how the rhythm of this is going and how much you and the men you were with are able to get some sleep and get some food and to stay rested as you move toward what is clearly going to be a much more stressful environment up around Baghdad.
Difficult to get much sleep in a moving M88, I can tell you that. But having said that, we cut a few hours of sleep because, as I said, because these guys were the lead element of this force, we left earlier than everyone else. But as a consequence, we stopped earlier than everyone else as they sort of grabbed this foothold out here in the desert. So when we stopped, we tried to catch a couple hours of sleep. Basically, you're kind of sleeping kind of knotted up in a position like that, but it's better than no sleep at all. As far as eating, we're eating the MREs, the meals ready to eat, which, frankly aren't that bad. Maybe if you're back in the States and have the option of some home cooking or a restaurant meal, you choose that instead. But out here in the desert, it beats the alternatives. And frankly, I found that the vegetarian meals contain a lot of fruit, which is always nice when you're out here in the desert. We're getting plenty of water, and the fact of the matter is, for us, is that, and I said this earlier, we're journalists. We're here to do our job. There's a certain degree of detachment that you have to have in that role because, well, it's easy to report on the U.S. military in this situation when things are going well. If things go poorly, we're going to have to say that as well and lay that out as explicitly as we are telling the good story right now. But having said that, these soldiers are taking good care of us. I mean, they've wrapped us in their warm embrace, and as a consequence, we're very well provided for. We're very well taken care of, and we definitely feel a kinship with these guys, even as much as there is that obvious professional distance that you try to maintain. Forrest?
Well, David, as you know, these are good and honorable men, and they are the best of us, and you are in good hands. I'm going to let you go. I'm going to do some recaps here as we move toward the top of the hour, but I thank you. I wish you Godspeed, and you stay safe with all the men out there.
Thanks, Forrest. Take care.
Let me just bring you up to date on where things are at this point. As you can see, the 3rd Infantry Division is moving right along at a pretty fast clip, heading toward Baghdad. Other forces have moved toward Basra, which is a Shia area that had been put down back in 1991 by Saddam Hussein in pretty powerful way. We are hearing from a British military spokesman that coalition forces have now taken control of the Al-Fa Peninsula. That wasn't too hard to do. They are making significant progress in their efforts to capture Basra itself. Bob Arnott told us that there was some fire that had been taken on there, and Jack Stradley, some Marines involved in that. So that is an actual fight that's been going on. But on the whole, this is being prosecuted in a way that the Americans must feel awfully good about. And remember, they are watching very carefully these possible surrender talks with high-ranking members of the Republican Guard, and we will very much like to see how that turns. But for now, I am Forrest Sawyer, heading toward 2 a.m. East Coast time, broad daylight in Iraq. We will be following this 24 hours a day. Do stay with us. For now, this is MSNBC.
Good morning to all of you on the East Coast. It is 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm Alex Witt with our MSNBC continuing coverage of Target Iraq. 11 p.m. Good evening to those of you on the Pacific Coast. We are taking a look right now at a live picture of downtown Baghdad. It is now 10 a.m. their local time. There you are seeing some movement on the streets there, though certainly not what one would expect to see under normal circumstances inside of Iraq. The capital city there of that country, some people going about their daily business and trying to have some sense of normalcy to their lives, but it certainly is not as crowded as one would assume at 10 a.m. on a weekday Friday. We also have a picture there of David Bloom of NBC News. He has been spending the better part of our evening with us. He is traveling there with the 3rd Infantry Division. They have now moved from their former base in Kuwait through across the border into the southern part of Iraq there in the desert. David, we will be speaking with you, but can you give us any sense of your location at all there, about how long you've been on the move there once you got into Iraqi territory?
Well, the attack began, the ground war, at 8 o'clock local time last night, which is noon on the East Coast, 9 a.m. on the West Coast, with about 30 minutes of artillery strikes. Then we moved into Iraq, across the Kuwaiti berm, through an electrified fence that had been cut, and then also through the Iraqi berm. We moved up to a forward position here in southern Iraq. That's about all I can say about where we are. And basically what we're doing is we've sort of grabbed the foothold here for the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, and then the rest of the troops are going to roll out of Kuwait and are in the process of doing that right now toward this location. When they get here and the force forms up, then they'll make some decisions about what routes they take up to Baghdad, if indeed that's where they're going, and certainly we know that that's where they're going.
All right, David, we're going to come back to you in just one moment. First, everybody, we're going to get you caught up in the latest headlines. This is an Operation Iraqi Freedom, as we are doing every quarter hour for you round the clock. Beginning with this, U.S.-led forces continue their ground assault from Kuwait into Iraq after a series of artillery barrages. British troops have stormed the Al-Fa Peninsula at the head of the Persian Gulf. That is a key route for oil tanker traffic. You just heard my colleague, NBC's Forrest Sawyer, telling us that it is believed those British troops have now taken control of the Al-Fa Peninsula. Meanwhile, huge explosions, they are heard near the southern Iraqi city of Basra. U.S. officials are saying that intelligence strongly indicates that Saddam was still inside the bunker. Possibly he was injured. All of this when that bunker was hit on Wednesday night. And the Washington Post is reporting that U.S. officials knew that Saddam was making taped statements, all in anticipation of Wednesday's deadline. Pentagon officials say no hostile fire involved in the crash of a U.S. Marine helicopter, much like the one you're going to see shortly on your screen. It was a CH-46 Sea Knight. It went down in Kuwait, killing all 16 aboard. We're told there were 4 Americans believed to be Marines, also 12 British paratroopers, we believe. The Sea Knight was assigned to the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. We are, of course, going to recap all the latest headlines on the Iraqi crisis for you every 15 minutes or so. You can also get the very latest anytime. To do that, go to the web, iraq.msnbc.com. All complete coverage for you, including the in-depth analysis, slideshows, video. You're going to find it all at iraq.msnbc.com. Just a short while ago, about an hour ago, the air raid sirens went off once again in Kuwait City. The fear a possible missile attack by Iraq could be a biological or chemical attack as well. Let's go straight to NBC's Don Teague. He is live in Kuwait City for us. Don, it's good to see you without the gas mask, Don, as we have come to see your familiar face behind that mask of late. Tell me what's going on right now.
Well, trust me, it's good to be here without the gas mask on as well, too. They gave us the all clear about 30 minutes ago. By my count, it's between the 8th and the 9th air raid siren that we've had in about 22 hours since around noon yesterday when this all started here. We've come to learn through experience that sometimes these air raid sirens just go away and then we don't hear the follow-up, and sometimes they did indeed signal the arrival of a missile inbound from Iraq. We know that the U.S. military has shot down at least 2 inbound missiles. We're not exactly sure what kind of missiles, but we are sure that it was Patriots that intercepted them successfully and brought them down. A 3rd missile that also was sent into this area, the military won't say, or they say they don't know specifically what brought it down, only that it also landed in an area away from any damage to people or equipment. But, you know, clearly we're taking all of these seriously. When the sirens go off, we're doing what we have been told to do and what the military does, which is mask up until we get an all clear that there are no chemicals involved.
Don, what about the people there in Kuwait City? Are they reacting as quickly and as fervently as you are there?
Well, that's hard to say. We don't see all of the people, but interestingly, the people we do see are probably people who either have a great deal of faith or simply have no masks and no way to protect themselves anyway, because during this last air raid, I watched a cricket game about a half a mile from here. I can see it from my vantage point. They never stopped playing cricket. I don't even know that anyone looked up to see if anything was flying over, but I've actually seen one Kuwaiti of the 2 million people in this country actually with a gas mask, so I don't know that there's many can do about it. We saw over the past few days that some were preparing safe rooms in their house, doing what we've been told about with duct tape and putting up plastic sheeting and such. And indeed, many people are not out on the streets. It's pretty vacant anywhere you go here, so we assume most people are at home and taking shelter there. But there are some people who are out just doing their thing, and the alarms don't seem to bother them at all.
Don, what about the weather, the heat there, and most importantly, perhaps those sandstorms? Have you been affected there by that?
No, you know, when the military is moving, they tend to sometimes create their own mini sandstorms because tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles kick up a tremendous amount of dust. There's also a low cloud ceiling today, which can cause problems for particularly helicopter pilots who are then forced to fly at lower levels. Generally in the military you fly at low levels anyway, but it takes away some of your options of getting up above the terrain, and if you combine sand with low clouds and some other issues, it can be difficult flying out there, particularly at night. Heat's not too big of a factor. It's shirt sleeve weather, but we had our jackets on until a couple of hours ago, so far the weather's really not that bad in that respect.
All right, thank you so much, NBC's Don Teague. We appreciate the live report. We will check in with you again there in Kuwait City. Now let's go back to NBC's David Bloom. He is traveling with the 3rd Infantry Division there. He is somewhere in the southern regions of Iraq, not too far beyond the Kuwaiti border, where he's been on the move, as he described, for probably about 14 hours now. Good, well, morning to you. I guess it must be approaching afternoon there. Well, no, it's shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning, I believe, David. Tell me what is the latest from there. Describe the setting for us.
Well, Alice, I mean, we're out in the middle of the desert is basically the setting. What this is the lead element of the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, which has about 20,000 soldiers in it. But we're with the 315 Infantry of the 2nd Brigade of the 3rd ID, which basically means these are the guys who were the first ones across the border into Iraq because, as I've said, their mission was to hit 2 observation posts, first with artillery, then with infantrymen, to make sure that they could not relay a message back to Baghdad as to where the 3rd ID would be rolling into southern Iraq from. Because obviously if they know where they're coming in from, they can anticipate what routes they might take, and this force obviously doesn't want them to do that. Right now we're stopped and basically waiting for the rest of the force to catch up with us, because obviously when you've got 6,000, 7,000 vehicles, 20,000 soldiers, it takes a long time to move them through those lanes into southern Iraq. So basically we're at a staging area here inside Iraq where the rest of the force will then catch up with us, and then depending upon what's going on in Baghdad with Saddam Hussein and his possible injury or, you know, maybe even death. We don't know what happened with him, but based upon what's happening on the ground, both in terms of Baghdad and in terms of the forces of the Republican Guard and the Special Republican Guard arrayed against them, then they'll make choices about how quickly they make a beeline for Baghdad.
David, how successful was that mission to clear the way? Was there any sort of significant encounters on behalf of those gentlemen there in the 3rd Infantry Division?
No, they've encountered only light opposition so far. What they were doing is they were hitting these 2 command posts, which each contained between 10 and 30 Iraqi soldiers. And, you know, not to be glib about it, but I mean, from their perspective, they wiped them out. And they felt like they had to do that because obviously they don't want a message getting relayed back to Baghdad as to their whereabouts. So they hit it hard with artillery for the first half hour. We were told, we were listening on the military radio, that they started the bomb. We could see the pictures, and maybe you guys have those and maybe you don't. We could see the artillery strikes going off in the distance, and we were told that at 8:07, 7 minutes later, those 2 command posts were wiped out. When we finally got up to them after the infantry soldiers had been there as well, all we saw was smoldering remains of those 2 command posts. So as I say, they've encountered only light opposition thus far. We're also hearing reports that the 11th regular Army division of the Iraqi Army has capitulated, has surrendered, and that other Iraqi regular Army divisions may be either contemplating or actively engaged in surrendering as well. If that's the case, and again, we don't know that definitively, we're hearing that over the military radio, but of course we're standing out here in the middle of the desert. But if that is the case, that's A, not surprising, because the regular Iraqi Army was not seen as a formidable fighting force, but B, it's also good news because obviously it suggests that some component of the Iraqi military structure is surrendering to the U.S. forces, which is exactly what they'd hoped for.
David, might some of those come and surrender to your group there, the 3rd Infantry Division, because you have moved into Iraq right now, and the reports are that Iraq's 11th Division there is moving southern, so it would seem that your 2 forces might meet up. Was that to be expected?
It could be. Again, I don't want to say too much about where they are and where we might be, but the fact of the matter is that, and I tried in my discussion with Forrest Sawyer a little while earlier to sort of allude to this as cryptically as I could. There were entreaties made long before this conflict began to those regular Army commanders to say, look, here's a capitulation document that you can sign, and if you sign this capitulation document, you won't have to fight, you can surrender, you can put your men in garrison, you can put your vehicles in a square, you can be separated from them, and we won't engage in hostilities. In fact, you can be in charge of your men, and we'll disarm you, obviously, but they're going to leave a very light force behind and keep on rolling. But whether this particular element of the 3rd Infantry Division has been in contact with them as yet, I can't say.
David, do you know how long you expect to be stationary there as you wait for the other troops to come and join you?
Interesting that you should ask that question, because I think that we're going to get rolling here momentarily. We'll try to show you some live pictures of that as we're moving along, but I got to wrap this up pretty quick, so if you've got maybe one more question, and then we've got to get going.
All right, David, one thing, how safe do you feel right now there in the middle of the desert? I see nothing but sand in the picture that we're looking at with you there on the phone to hear my questions. I've seen a couple of tanks off in the distance a bit, but they are not in a large grouping. So do you feel like you could be any kind of a target, or are you just so lone and isolated that absolutely not?
Yeah, I think that right now we feel pretty alone and isolated. I mean, having said that, there's artillery that they could certainly rain down upon us, which is notoriously inaccurate but still deadly if by happenstance it happens to hit you. There's also the possibility that that artillery could be loaded with chemical munitions, biological agents, which is why we're in these chem suits, what they call MOP 1, which means that you've got the chem pants on, you've got the chem top on, but you don't have your gas mask on, you don't have your boots on, you don't have your gloves on. So, I mean, it's certainly the case that there are potential threats out here. Having said that, we're comparatively safe. The fight that they anticipate fighting isn't here. It's much closer to Baghdad.
All right, NBC's David Bloom, you've said you have to get rolling there with the 3rd Infantry Division. We do appreciate your live report, David. Do stay safe, David, and we'll check in with you again as soon as we can.
Thanks, Alice.
All right, let's go now to Central Command, the very latest on the Marine helicopter crash and also the situation in the Iraqi city of Basra. To do that, we're joined by NBC's David Schuster. He is live at CENTCOM in Qatar with all of that. Good morning to you, David.
Alex, good morning. And the numbers seem to be changing a little bit regarding that CH-46E Sea Knight. Our British colleagues are now reporting that they've been told that there were only 8 British soldiers that were on board that aircraft. Earlier, Central Command had said that there were 12. And that there were 4 Americans. In any case, 4 Americans apparently killed, 8 or 12, depending on what the information is, that were on board that helicopter. In any case, the information is that that chopper went down at about 3 o'clock in the morning, local time here. It was en route back from Iraq. It was 8 miles apparently across the border into Kuwait when, according to officials here, there was no evidence, no indication whatsoever of any hostile or enemy fire, but rather that this was a weather-related problem. This particular kind of helicopter has 2 rotors, which can tend to kick up a lot of dust. And remember also that the pilot was using night vision goggles at the time, and that can make a judgment very difficult as far as trying to figure out where the ground is and looking at the horizon. And that seems to have, at least, there's some indications that may have contributed to this crash. But again, everybody on board that chopper was killed. British and American authorities are apparently now on the scene. It apparently took them a couple hours to get there, but they are reviewing what happened. As this is going on, of course, there's also more information coming out now about what's happening in southern Iraq. British military officials are suggesting that the Al-Far Peninsula, a key peninsula of southern Iraq, is now completely controlled by coalition forces, and that these coalition forces are marching towards Basra. Basra, a very important city in southern Iraq. It's the 2nd largest city in Iraq. It's a mostly Shiite population that has now no great love for Saddam Hussein after rebellion there 12 years ago was brutally crushed by forces loyal to Saddam. There's every expectation here at Central Command that when coalition forces take the city of Basra, there'll be some sort of jubilation and celebration in the streets, that the coalition forces will be seen as liberators. And Central Command very eager to have those sort of pictures transmitted across the Middle East, but also across the rest of Iraq, in the hopes that somehow that will crush the spirits of Iraqi soldiers, perhaps still putting up a fight towards Baghdad. The other important thing that we're being told by, again, British military officials here is that some key oil equipment, some oil pumping equipment, which is essentially Saddam Hussein's pipeline into the Persian Gulf, that is now in control of coalition forces, and that this pipeline had the potential, if Saddam wanted to cause some trouble or try to slow down coalition forces, that he could have either lit the pumping equipment on fire, or he could have simply pumped a lot of oil into the Persian Gulf to make matters worse and sort of get rid of his oil that way. That has not happened. Military officials very satisfied that this oil pumping equipment, some of the oil fields in southern Iraq are now in coalition control. No fires, at least in these particular oil fields and the oil pumping equipment closest to the Persian Gulf. And again, every indication that Basra is a key city where coalition forces clearly marching towards Basra. They clearly have an objective of trying to take it perhaps very soon. Alex?
All right, David, but I want you to once again reiterate the numbers we were talking about in terms of the fatalities in that chopper crash. You say that we are amending those numbers downward now?
Well, British military officials now apparently saying that there were only 8 British Royal Marine Commandos who were on that chopper. We had initially been told by U.S. Central Command that there were 12, but now that figure has apparently changed to 8 British Royal Marines on board. And then the number of Americans on board has not changed. We're still being told 4 Marines, that would be the crew of this transport helicopter, 4 Marines killed on board.
All right, NBC's David Schuster at CENTCOM and Gutter. Thank you very much for that live report. We will check in with you again as well, David. And now it is just about 2:15 of 2 a.m. here on the East Coast. Let's get you caught up with the very latest headlines as we do round the clock here in our coverage of Target Iraq. These headlines in Operation Iraqi Freedom now. U.S. and British military officials report that oil fires in southern Iraq. The cause of those fires is unknown at this time. Also, NBC News' David Bloom is reporting that the Iraqi 11th Army Division may have surrendered to coalition forces. U.S. Central Command has not yet confirmed this information. However, if true, this surrender would mark a major setback for Saddam Hussein's defense capability. There is also some evidence this morning that Saddam may have been injured. Intelligence sources are saying that emergency medical personnel were sent to the bunker after it was hit on Wednesday night. Intelligence officials believe that Saddam, as well as family members, notably 2 of his sons, also other Iraqi leaders, were still in the bunker at the time of that strike. San Francisco police have arrested more than 1,000 people in anti-war protests. It is the most taken into custody on a single day in that city in decades. Thousands of anti-war protesters have swarmed around ramps onto San Francisco's Bay Bridge. We are now going to go to our Bianca Sorlizano. She's at the Listening Post with a recap of what's going on and how all the news headlines are playing out around the world. Good morning to you, Bianca.
Good morning to you, Alex. Well, this is interesting. Our viewers have been watching coverage here in the United States, seeing how we here in the U.S. are covering this war, but we're looking around the world now, seeing how other countries are covering this war. Our first stop for you right now, headlines out of Japan. This comes from Mainichi Daily News. There's an article here. They're expressing fear about one of the human shields. Right now in Baghdad, there's supposed to be 30 Japanese, about 17 of those 30 reporters, and 6 human shields. Well, foreign ministry officials say that since the bombing started, they cannot get in contact with one of those human shields. They're trying to track him down, but of course they are now worried for his life, worried for his safety. That's one of the stories, moving from human shields to TV ratings in Japan. I'm going to read this from here. The headline says, "War, a boon for NHK." That's a Japanese broadcasting company. Taxpayer-funded broadcasting company. NHK can expect a ratings boon after being swamped by callers regarding the war in Iraq. So they're talking about how people there want to watch and know what's going on with this war in Japan. They said that on the night when the bomb started to drop, they originally were going to show a drama called Oshin, which was being screened to commemorate the 50th anniversary of television broadcasts in Japan. And ironically, it was enormously popular when it first aired 20 years ago, especially in the Middle East, especially in Iraq. But they pulled that off air that night, showed war coverage, and people were watching. So those are just some of the headlines beyond the basics in Japan, how they are covering this war right now. And Alex, next time around, I'll tell you some stories that are making the papers, making the headlines in this war from Australia.
All right, we'll look forward to that. Thank you so much. Our Bianca Sorlizano at the Listening Post. Let's go right now to the Pentagon. That is where NBC's Carl Rochelle is standing by with the latest from there. Carl, I understand we have some new video we can bring to our viewers on that raid from Baghdad last night. Look at the lighting up of the sky right there with some direct hits, certainly.
Yeah, flying some hardware in there, and it looks to me like what we're seeing there, Alex, is some Tomahawk cruise missiles launched in there, but we are not getting operational information on that right now. It's still out there. We're still trying to check it out. We're trying to check out a number of things. One is the discrepancy in the figures on the casualties from the CH-46 helicopter that went down, and David Schuster was reporting now that the British were saying 8. The last figures we have from the U.S. side is that there There were 4 U.S. Marines on that chopper that went down that did die, and there apparently is some discrepancy in the numbers. We're hearing both 8 British Marines or British soldiers, and also we're hearing 12, which would make the casualty totals either 12 or 16, depending on how you do it. So we're still trying to sort out those. We do know that it was flying at 3 a.m. Apparently would be using night vision goggles, night vision equipment at that time of evening. Absolutely no one's confirming that for us here at this point. And also we are told that it was an accident, that it did not go down as a result of friendly fire. Looking at those pictures of Baghdad, I can tell you one thing, that we are told by government sources that that emergency medical equipment was rolled into that bunker in Baghdad that Saddam Hussein was believed to have been in early Thursday morning Iraqi time, late Wednesday evening U.S. time, Eastern time, when 3 dozen Tomahawk cruise missiles hit that area, and the bombs, the bunker buster bombs from those 2 F-117s hit it. Still no readout for sure on whether Saddam Hussein was taken out or not. We are told that he did, in fact, make videotapes, believed to have made videotapes in advance of the attack. The reason why you know that is because they believe there were no direct references to any of the strikes that took place on Iraq. Even though the date was mentioned, the date was easy to come up with because President George Bush had set a deadline date, so you could factor a date in, but not a time. They're still trying to determine when those tapes were made and try to determine whether Saddam Hussein is still alive or not. But we are told by these government sources that the presence of him on Iraqi television is not a confirmation that he's still alive, Alex.
Carl, interestingly, the Washington Post has an article which is going to post in just a short while in the morning when it comes out. And there is a woman who claims that she was Saddam Hussein's mistress in Iraq for many years. She is among the people who have looked at Saddam Hussein on this tape. She does not believe that the person in that tape is Saddam Hussein. And in fact, this is a woman who has worked with officials before in intelligence and has led them to the evidence of a double acting as Saddam Hussein. Is there any reaction to that inside the Pentagon at all?
I was told, Alex, by my sources that don't go too hard on the body double idea, but there were some serious questions raised about whether this was in fact Saddam Hussein. And the reasons they pointed out are he is wearing glasses in this picture. He is reading from what appears to be a steno pad. That is quite different from the normal appearances of Saddam Hussein on TV. Typically, he does not wear glasses. He uses a teleprompter. He puts on a very slick presentation, if you will, a very professional presentation. He could be an Iraqi TV anchor almost. His presentation is that professional. And that's one of the reasons they say Saddam Hussein, they're not really sure whether it is him or is not him. They are trying to determine that. They're looking at the tape to see when it was made, if they can figure that out. They're also doing a comparison with a voice print, a voice analysis of that to see if it does in fact match the way they work those things up, the lines on graphs on certain words. It will tell you speech patterns to try to see if in fact it is Saddam Hussein. But we don't know, quite frankly, whether he's alive, whether he's wounded or injured, or whether he is dead. We're still trying to find that out, and so is the U.S. government, by the way, Alex.
All right, Carl, we will look to you for the answers once those questions have been answered. Thank you so much. Do appreciate your time. NBC's Carl Rochelle at the Pentagon. Well, instead of unleashing a full air assault, the U.S. and Britain launched precision strikes into Baghdad several hours ago. It was the second time that the capital city was struck. With me now in our war room to discuss what's going on right now is retired Marine Major Jack Stradley and Dan Garay, the Vice President of the Lexington Institute. That is a nonprofit public policy research organization. Dan, by the way, was also a former Defense Department official during the Persian Gulf War. Gentlemen, glad to have you both,
Morning,
Major
Alice.
and Dan.
Morning.
Let's talk about these. First of all, to you, Major. Now, these were precision strikes, were they not?
Absolutely. They were Tomahawk missiles, also probably F-117 stealth fighters dropping precision-guided ordnance.
And how does this differ from the kind of precision strikes that we were able to do 12 years ago in the first Gulf War?
Well, the similar weapon systems. We had the Tomahawk missiles then, we had the stealth fighters then. It's just several generations more advanced, better guidance system, more pinpoint accuracy. Where we were coming accurate to dozens of yards back then, we're coming down to literally feet now.
So how how do they hone in on these sites? Is it a GPS-guided system?
Well, it depends. Yes, the Tomahawk uses a combination of inertial guidance and GPS and several other things, terrain following features, to take it to its actual target, what's programmed in. And it can also be adjusted once it's in flight.
Okay. I want to ask you, Dan, about these precision bombings. Do we know, first of all, why we've decided to go this route instead of do the shock and awe, the unleashing of everything that we've got in the initial stages of this campaign?
One has to assume that this was intended from the beginning, not driven by the target of opportunity. That's too simple. That means we had to have had contacts and probably intelligence sources inside the Iraqi high command, inside the military, that suggested that with a little push in the right direction, we might get this system to collapse from inside. And there's at least some indications, you've been hearing it from David Bloom and others, that this might be true. We might be seeing a wholesale defection or surrender of Iraqi units.
Would that mean that we would never have to launch the shock and awe strategy?
That's right. One might not have to do that, or we would do it in very selected areas. For example, against some of the Republican Guard units, if they persist in resisting. So it would not be, global shock and awe across Iraq. It would be, if you will, precision shock and awe.
And indeed, Major, one of these locations was the Iraqi Republican Guard, was it not? One of their headquarters?
It was their headquarters in Baghdad. So we're consistently going after significant targets of command and control, air defense facilities, communications facilities. Very consistent campaign to, again, decapitate the Iraqi government, the military leadership.
And how crucial is the Iraqi Republican Guard to any sort of success militarily for Saddam Hussein?
Well, it's absolutely crucial. The Republican Guard, the Special Republican Guard, the Special Security Services are the most well-trained, the most loyal troops there. They're the only ones that we expect to really put up a fight. They're not a match for the forces that they're facing from the U.S. and coalition, but they are, in fact, probably going to fight to some degree.
All right, Dan, I'm also being told MSNBC has learned that a special security organization in Baghdad was also struck. What do you know about that? And are these the same kinds of things, again, that were struck back in '91?
Yes, actually they were. The special security organization is run by Saddam's youngest son, Qusay. It is really the guardians of the guardians, if you will. It is there to keep an eye on the Republican Guard and the other security organizations. It is about somewhere around 5,000 troops. They do special communications, which is probably why they were struck. They do some of the security service stuff. They're really, in a sense, the ultimate goon squad, perhaps the Gestapo of Iraq.
So these are all facilities that have been wiped out 12 years ago and rebuilt from the ground up?
Well, they were struck. Some of them were struck very heavily, and essentially the buildings were destroyed. In other cases, they were only damaged. It varied rather widely, but it turns out that the Iraqis, bless their little hearts, went right back and rebuilt these facilities and went right back to business. So, to a certain extent, it's known sites. We've done this before.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to stand by just for a moment. We want to reset for all of you. We are rapidly approaching the bottom of the hour. I'm Alex Witt, and as promised, we are giving you the latest headlines every quarter hour. This in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Let's bring you up to date right now on Target Iraq. A British military spokesman says coalition forces have taken control of the Al-Far Peninsula, this in southern Iraq. The official also says that forces are making significant progress in their efforts to capture the key southern Iraqi city of Basra. Also, the BBC News now reporting that scores of Iraqi troops have surrendered to British Royal Marine commandos operating in southern Iraq. Officials at U.S. Central Command now say that 12 casualties in the crash of a U.S. Marine helicopter in Kuwait are confirmed. The Pentagon officials say, however, no hostile fire was involved in that crash of the CH-46. That sea night went down, killing all 12 on board, 4 Americans and 8 British. The Sea Knight was assigned to the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. Meantime, the U.S. Senate unanimously approved a resolution in support of all those forces. This resolution expressed gratitude to the troops, their families, also offered support for the president as our commander-in-chief. It also thanked British Prime Minister Tony Blair and his government in the UK for their support. We will recap the latest headlines on the Iraqi crisis for you every 15 minutes. And you can also get the very latest anytime on our web. To do that, go to iraq.msnbc.com. Gentlemen, I want to get back with you, retired Marine Major Jack Stradley, also Dan Garay. Let's get back to the attacks, the assaults on Iraq. Again, the question being no more the shock and awe. It's not necessarily a crucial part to success if things go as expected, Dan.
Absolutely. It may be that we don't have to inflict the kind of destruction or casualties that we once thought we would have to do, or it'll be restricted. It may involve only attacks upon the Republican Guard, Special Republican Guard, very selective, and we will be able to occupy essentially most of Iraq without much of a conflict being conducted.
What about presidential palaces, Major? Presidential palaces and the like being a place to target in advance of allowing Saddam Hussein to get there. In other words, eradicate that kind of a safe house which he might go to.
Well, very legitimate targets. And you have to understand those presidential palaces are actually military encampments. There are troops there. There are communications facilities there, bunkers, things like that. So targeting those things is essential to the prosecution of this campaign, and they are legitimate targets. I'm sure they're on a target list and will be executed in due course.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said it was Tomahawk missiles that were launched into that Ministry of Information, I believe, building where Saddam Hussein is believed to have been with perhaps his sons underneath. How far deep down do those Tomahawk missiles go?
Well, normally a Tomahawk missile or a cruise missile is generally a conventional one, carries about 2,000 pounds of high explosives. And so they go in and can take out the buildings fairly easily, level those, create shrapnel, kill people on the ground. What happened after that, though, was the two F-117 stealth fighters dropped bunker buster bombs, 2,000-pound bombs with special fusing that allows them to delay, penetrate concrete, penetrate earth, and explode much deeper in the ground. And so the idea was to come in, knock out the things on the ground, maybe create a little bit of a hole, if you will, and then come in and with a precision-guided, laser-guided munition, specifically target what was thought to be the bunker and drive it deep and try and create a shock effect down there, blow it up.
And in what kind of rapid succession would the Tomahawks then lead to those that were dropped, the bunker busters?
They would be right on top of each other. The coordination of that kind of thing can be down to literally within seconds. The F-117s are on station, standing by as the Tomahawks start to explode. There's a timeline, and they would roll in literally seconds after the last explosion went off of the Tomahawk missiles.
Dan, is it believed that all these presidential palaces and these important buildings, official buildings of the Iraqi government inside Baghdad, have these sort of bunkers underneath them that have been built for security, for safe houses?
Oh, lots of them have it for a whole variety of reasons. Look, this was going on well before even the first Gulf War. The Iraqis have been at war for well over 2 decades. You put these bunkers under all kinds of buildings. They learned, of course, after the first Gulf War, the importance of trying to dig deep as a way of defending against U.S. weapons.
Also, Major, I want to ask you about the explosions that have been heard in Mosul. Can you tell me what you believe is going on there right now and why?
Well, we have some oil fields up in the area of Mosul and in northern Iraq there. Not real sure. We haven't got a lot of really good reports of what might be going on up there. There's some information about the Kurds up there possibly moving into that area. There's also the potential for some light infantry, either air mobile or airborne, moving up to the north potentially to secure the area of the oil fields there. But really, I don't know. I'm just purely speculating right now.
Is it possible that these explosions are not as a result of U.S. artillery strikes, that this would be something perhaps, as you said, the Kurds are there, this could be something localized that way?
It could be any number of things, yes.
Okay, gentlemen, I want to thank you very much. We'll have you back and discuss a little more about what's going on right now. Dan Garay and Major Stradley, thank you so much. All right, let's head right now to the White House. Let's get right now to our Jessica Yellen, who is covering things from there for us. And Jessica, tell us the reaction of the president today to the day's events.
Hi, Alex. Well, from the White House, there was very cautious comment about the progress of the war so far, but in private, administration officials seemed pleased with that progress. The battlefield reports, they say, were encouraging. They say they even had signs that top Iraqi leadership may already be crumbling. Now, of course, that mood was dampened by news that 16 U.S. and British troops died in the crash of that Marine helicopter we've been reporting about. So far, the president did not comment on that, but I wouldn't be surprised if you see him express his condolences to their families later today. Now, at the end of this evening, the president retired to the residence. Before he went to sleep, he got late-night briefings by both Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and his National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice. He plans to depart for Camp David later today. Now, if you listen overall to the messages coming out of all branches of the administration, you'll hear a continued message of the inevitability of coalition victory. You keep hearing it. They are insistent that Saddam Hussein will be overthrown, if in fact he hasn't been killed already. Of course, officials still are not saying if they believe Saddam is dead or alive, and again, cautious with their comments on that topic as well. Now, again, administration officials confirm that discussions are ongoing with members of the Iraqi Republican Guard, that country's elite military force. You've been discussing that with the military experts there. Of course, there are obvious psychological and strategic advantages of high-level defections, as you've been discussing, but it also would be a great political victory for the White House as well, and we could talk a bit more about that if you like. Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about that.
Okay, the Republican Guard, as I said, not only defends Saddam Hussein, but they also protect the city of Baghdad itself. And if this Republican Guard were to crumble in any significant way, it means that the U.S. could possibly avoid a pitched battle over Baghdad, which has been a great concern for a number of reasons, partly because from the beginning of war planning, there have been worries that coalition troops might get drawn into very ugly street fighting in Baghdad with high casualties, both among allies and Iraqi civilians, and all of it quite possibly caught on U.S. and Arab television. Both would be a tragedy and very bad in terms of public perception. So if these top guard members defect and that weakens defenses for Baghdad, it could be a great political victory for the White House. Alex?
Jessica, let's also talk about these more countries now that have been added to the list of nations supporting the war effort. I told 15 more just today. Can you tell us a bit more details about that?
Right. It's the so-called coalition of the willing that the White House has been talking about. Some of those new countries include places like Costa Rica, Mongolia, the Solomon Islands, all places where support is really symbolic more than anything else. But the White House continues to hammer home on this point that there is broad support internationally for this war effort, that every major religion and ethnicity is represented. But as you know, many traditional U.S. allies still do remain fiercely opposed to the war effort. Alex?
Indeed. Thank you so much for the live report there from Washington. MSNBC's Jessica Yellen. Thanks, Jessica. We'll check in with you again as well. We're getting some news right now, everyone, from Reuters wire service. They are quoting the BBC and telling us that the Kirkuk oil fields in Iraq have now been secured. We're not sure if they've been secured by British or U.S. forces, but certainly by the coalition forces there. Once again, Reuters wire service telling us, according to the BBC, the Kirkuk oil fields have now been secured. Of course, all this on the heels of southern Iraqi oil fields being lit on fire, supposedly. We've had some NASA intelligence gathering the information for us from satellites way up high in the sky, and we were told that there were 2 oil fields on fire. There has yet to be concrete confirmation on the number of oil fields that could be on fire, but we know there are some there in the south. Kirkuk oil fields being there in the north. Again, once again, we do believe they have been secured. Let's go right now from this information to the Arab nation of Jordan right now. That is where relief workers there are bracing for a flood of refugees fleeing Iraq. NBC's Mike Taibbi, he joins us live near the Jordanian-Iraqi border with more on this impending crisis. Good morning to you.
Hi, Alex. How are you doing? And the word impending is the correct one here. The crisis hasn't really arrived yet. Not that there haven't been difficulties. This is the camp behind me, one of the 2 here. It's called Camp B, Camp Bravo, for third country nationals, that is non-Iraqis living in Iraq who have left Iraq because of the war and want to go back to their home countries or need to go back to their home countries. As I say, not without problems. It's always the young and the old who are most affected, most profoundly affected by this type of trauma, having to uproot and move. We have information that 1 older man and 1 infant, 1 newborn, as it was described to us, were taken to hospital. The older man had a heart attack. We don't know the status of either his medical condition or that of the child. About 440 people were kept overnight in this camp. They got up this morning at first light. We were here at that point. Everybody seemed in reasonably good shape at that point. Some kids were playing soccer. Other people were gathering their goods, bringing their suitcases out in front of their tent, because the plan is, the second part of the plan is to leave from here via bus and go back to Amman to arrange transportation from there back to their home country. We spoke a little bit earlier with Sebastian Carlier, who's with the International Red Crescent Red Cross, and he explained the circumstances of the travel for the people who had to spend the night here.
The things are looking better now. It's still very cold, about maybe 5 degrees, so people are not really used to that kind of temperature here, but things are okay now.
From the time, on average, from the time that they left Baghdad, got on that bus, until the time they were situated in a shelter here, you say it was at least a 12-hour drive. How long in total was it that they had to spend before they could finally sit down and be situated here?
According to some of them, I mean, for instance, I talked to somebody like a couple of minutes ago. He said that they left Baghdad yesterday at 12 o'clock, at noon. So, and they came today at 7 o'clock. So this trip was really long. But some other people said yesterday that it took them like 12 or 15 hours.
Now, we use generic terms to describe this part of the crisis, refugees on the move, having to get transportation. You can see behind me that the buses are ready to take most of the people who are here, about 200 of the 300 or so who are still here, off to Amman. But they're all individual stories, and we spoke with a number of those families. One in particular, a man about my age, 52 years old, with a wife and one child, same circumstance I have, who has built a life and a career and has a bank account, an apartment, or had those things, because he decided as soon as President Bush gave his ultimatum to Saddam Hussein that he himself, and his name is Motasim Mohammed, had himself been given an ultimatum, and he decided to go to his embassy and to arrange to leave to become a refugee, now on the way back to Amman. This is Mike Taibbi reporting. Back to you, Alex.
All right, Mike, I do want to ask you, though, certainly Jordan is not very keen on having a flood of refugees come their way. And in fact, Secretary Donald Rumsfeld earlier this evening said that people in Iraq should stay in their country. Aren't there provisions being made to help refugees or people who are displaced by any possible military activity to stay there, get them food, get them shelter, get them water, get them medical supplies, but staying within the country of Iraq?
Yeah, actually, a lot of those plans have been discussed, but they're always in flux. Presumably on the other side of the border in the no man's land or just east of that, still in Iraq, there are plans of maybe housing some people there and getting shelter kits in position there. But Jordan, as a contiguous country on the other side of the border, is preparing for an onslaught, a flood as you described it before. Perhaps as many as 100,000, 200,000 refugees if the bombing becomes so intense that that flood starts. It kind of feeds on itself. And people are not going to want to stay in Iraq because they feel it still is a target. And it's the individual refugee who makes a decision that I'm going to become one, I'm going to leave. And that's what these people have done, leaving lives that have been established. That's what tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands are thinking of doing at that point of decision right now as the war is in its third day.
Mm-hmm. And any kind of creature comforts there, I mean, how hard is it to live under those conditions for any length of time, Mike?
Well, this is not, you know, a couple of days of light roughing it in the country, the camping trips that some of us might remember from our childhood. This is, you get on a bus, you travel for 15, 19 hours, you get processed at several points, and you find yourself in a cold place. He was talking about 5 degrees centigrade before, about 40 degrees. It felt colder than that this morning. You sleep in a tent, which may be reasonable enough, but the dust was blowing in. You get up and you take a walk across the cold to a latrine that's been set up. You can wash in these spigots that have been set up because there is running water. Hopefully there's enough food, and I say hopefully because there have been problems with some of the NGOs running these camps and getting enough money to provide all the resources. They say they do it, they can do it, they can handle 5,000 at present, more than that if necessary, and more than that again if the third step arrives where they have 20,000 filling this one camp to capacity. But it's not an easy life, and you know the kids were laughing this morning. We talked to some of them, and they seemed okay. It's one night, but if it goes on for 2 nights, 3 nights, 4 nights, and the uncertainty on the other end of where they're going to go, it wears you down. And as I said, the stress was enough that one man had a heart attack, and we don't know the medical problem that sent the newborn to the hospital, but it's difficult. It really is.
All right, Mike Taibbi, thank you very much for that live report from the refugee camp there along the Jordanian-Iraqi border. We'll check in with you again as well. We are now at 45 past the hour. As promised, the very latest headlines now in Operation Iraqi Freedom for you. U.S. and British military officials report oil fires in southern Iraq. The cause of these fires unknown at this time. Also, NBC News' David Bloom is reporting that the Iraqi 11th Army Division may have surrendered to coalition forces. U.S. Central Command has not yet confirmed this information. However, if true, This surrender would mark a major setback for Saddam Hussein's defense capability. There is also evidence that Saddam himself may have been injured. Intelligence sources are saying that emergency medical personnel were sent to the bunker that Saddam Hussein and his two sons were believed to have been in downtown Baghdad. This after it was hit on Wednesday night. Intelligence officials believe Saddam and other Iraqi leaders were still in that bunker at the time of the strike. Back domestically, San Francisco police arresting more than 1,000 people in anti-war protests. It is the most taken into custody on any single day in that city in decades. Thousands of anti-war protesters swarmed around ramps onto San Francisco's Bay Bridge. We're going to recap the latest headlines on the Iraqi crisis for you every 15 minutes right here on MSNBC. You can also get the very latest anytime on the web. To do that, you go to iraq.msnbc.com for complete coverage. The in-depth analysis slideshows, also video. Once again, go to iraq.msnbc.com for that. Let's go right now to MSNBC's Bob Arnott. He is somewhere along the northern Kuwait border there. We're told he's with the Expeditionary Forces. You've been riding on choppers, Bob. Tell me what you know about the chopper that went down earlier that killed at least 4 U.S. servicemen.
Well, this was the most dramatic. It was really the boldest military foray in the war so far. A dramatic insertion into Iraq to secure some of the oil-producing fields. We do not want to tell you where. Tremendous amount of fire. AC-130 gunships laying down fire being returned. The Cobras from our base here were able to suppress a great deal of that fire. They are still in action. Our mission was to take British commandos into that region. We were with one squad. I do not want to give the name, but unfortunately one of our helos did go down. We'll just take a moment and just tell you how privileged and honored we were to own these men here at our base. We saw them enter their helicopter, 4 Americans. We saw 8 British commandos enter this helicopter. The flight conditions at the time we took off were reasonable. Thick sort of haze, but probably 2 to 3 miles of visibility. East of our camp, the visibility went down to between 1/4 and 1/2 of a mile. With night vision goggles, it's impossible to see that kind of visibility. Sand spewing in the air, a wind enough to get a good deal of sand there. The report is that, eyewitness account is that the helicopter pitched down and that there was a fireball on impact. Our condolences to these families. I think those words probably are not strong enough to express the feelings that we have for these men, that we know other Marines at this base do. It's a tremendous tragedy. We were the trap aircraft. A recovery aircraft. We were sent actually to recover these individuals, hoping they were still alive, and then we were called off when we found that they had not survived. The mission itself is said to be a success. British troops are engaged at this point. They have been able to secure all the major targets in ongoing operations. I don't want to tell you where it is. It does have to do with a major part of the oil distilling and distribution business in Iraq. Strategically, here we are at a base of tremendous air assets here. So I was lying down in the desert last night when we first hear the Predators go overhead, very loud engine. You hear the C-130s come in overhead. Our helos up, 46 and 53s, the Cobras, the command control. It was a very, very dramatic scene last night. Not much resistance being met by the mechanized units moving up over the border, but this is a deep, deep inversion. Very bold move by the U.S. Marines here, who like to think that they are first and foremost, and often are. They had to use night vision goggles. So I was able to use some of the goggles, and it really does sort of bring a day to night, except in that circumstance where you have a tremendous amount of sand and very, very low visibility. At that point, the rest of the mission was called off, brought back. We are back here at base, and we are ready to resupply units that are in there and on standby here as the key intelligence headquarters here, where intelligence is being gathered on a minute-by-minute basis on operations inside Iraq. Back to you.
Bob, can you tell us with whom those British troops are right now engaged in combat that you referred to? Is it members of Iraq's 11th Infantry Division, or do you know?
We've very specifically been asked not to communicate division numbers. What we know is that there is a real firefight ongoing. This is a strategic target. The Iraqis are dug in deep. They fired back at Cobra gunships, not a really smart move usually. They fire back at the AC-130s. They have a unit you throw a lot about, which is the DSU-23 millimeter anti-aircraft gun. These are ubiquitous. The anti-aircraft weapon of choice throughout southern Iraq. You could use it with radar, but often use it without radar. They're firing U.S. forces there. Real firefights, but despite this, the British commanders have been able to form a major blocking action so that the Republican Guard cannot escape out of that region to try and protect Baghdad. And that's been a very, very important move for this war. Again, a tremendously dramatic mission, and our hearts really go out to those crewmen. As I say, we got to know and love their
And Bob, my final question to you on a personal note for those soldiers who have lost their comrades. How difficult is it for them to understand they have lost their friends, their compatriots, and yet have to move on? How well can they do that?
Well, it was interesting. I was speaking to one of our Cubans named Buell. He was best friends with the pilot of the aircraft. I actually was down yesterday morning with the pilot, what they call the comfort trailer, where you shave and you have a shower. And I asked him, and there's a steely resolve there. I mean, he was bitterly disappointed. He was clearly suffering greatly. But like so many other members of the crew, just one last thought before you're out here, is that we've heard so far that this is the mission that we've got to do. It's changed for them what's happened. People are now saying, we're going to go out and we're going to kick some butt. We're angry now, we're going to get back. These Marines are charged up and they're ready to retaliate for what happens to their fellow Marines.
All right, Bob Arnott there somewhere in northern Kuwait. We will not divulge your location for security reasons. Thank you very much for the live report, Rob. Much appreciated. Well, a very key part of the military strategy has been to prevent the Scud missile attacks on Israel. Of course, Iraq fired dozens of the Scuds at Israel back in the 1991 Gulf War. There is now fear, of course, of chemical or biological weapons being associated with any kind of incoming missiles into Israel. Let's go right now to Keith Miller. He's in Tel Aviv with the very latest for us on that front. Good morning to you, Keith.
Good morning, Alex. Well, I can tell you that here the